Our episodes deal with serious and often distressing incidents. If you feel at any time you need support, please contact your local crisis centre. For suggested phone numbers for confidential support, please see the show notes for this episode on your app or on our website. The Silk Road was an ancient network of trade routes that started in China in the 2nd century BC. Via a combination of roads and sea routes, goods like silk, paper and spices were transported from the producers in Asia to markets in Europe. Eventually, it wasn't just goods that were traded. There were also ideas, customs, religions, and even diseases. The Silk Road expanded throughout different continents and civilizations for several centuries. It connected Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, a marketplace across the world. Two major expansions can be traced back to the Silk Road. One of these was the introduction of Buddhism into China. The second was the Black Death. Vermin accompanied some of the goods along the Silk Road, and upon the vermin were fleas. These fleas carried the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, and as the fleas entered Europe, so did the plague. It's estimated that in the 14th century, between 100 and 125 million people died from the Black Death, reducing the world's population by somewhere between 30 and 60%. The Silk Road is recognised as the very first true globalisation that the world experienced. The free trade of goods and the passing of ideas and customs from one society to another. It changed everything. It would be many centuries later that a very different kind of marketplace would open up on a modern platform, a new trade route using the same name. Silk Road. Ross William Ulbricht was born on March 27, 1984, in Austin, Texas. From a young age, he was described as social, curious, kind, helpful, and resourceful. He joined the Boy Scouts and got to the rank of Eagle Scout, just like his father had. After school, Ross earned a full scholarship to study physics at the University of Texas in Dallas. He fell in love with a girl at university, and at the time of his graduation in 2006, he proposed to her. But his girlfriend confessed that she'd been seeing various other men on the side, and all plans for a wedding were called off. Ross returned to his hometown and tried to figure out what to do with his life. He tried out for the Amazing Race television show with his sister, and when that didn't work out, he decided to continue with his studies. He applied for a master's degree at Pennsylvania State University, and once again he got a full scholarship. His focus was on material science and engineering. Up to that point, Ross was deeply interested in mathematics, science, and nature. But at Penn State, his interest shifted dramatically. He joined a club that explored a subject that fascinated him to no end: libertarianism. Libertarianism is based on the concept that everything a person does should be up to them, not anyone else. Essentially, it advocates minimal government intervention in the lives of its citizens. Ross was especially interested in the theories of Ludwig von Mises and the Austrian School of Economics, which support the view that people are their own rulers and don't need a government to regulate them. Ross adopted a very different lifestyle because of this new interest. He moved into a basement because he got it for free, and he got his clothes for free from a friend that handled a second-hand store. Ross's idea was to see if he could live with nothing more than the necessities, a less materialistic life. Ross was also a part of other clubs at Penn State. One of them was an African drumming club. During one of the club's get-togethers, he met a fellow student by the name of Julia. Julia was 18 years old at the time, 6 years younger than Ross. Julia and Ross's time together is outlined in the book American Kingpin by Nick Bilton. She remembered seeing Ross and thinking he looked homeless, with his torn-up clothes and unkempt beard. Ross struck up a conversation with Julia, and 1 week later they saw each other again. This time, Ross had shaved his beard and was dressed more presentably. He asked Julia out, and she agreed. They went out for dinner, after which they ended up back at Ross's basement, where Julia saw how he lived. When she asked him about his less materialistic lifestyle, Ross explained that he was part of a libertarian club, and he was experimenting. Julia didn't quite understand what libertarianism was, and Ross explained the basic concept. He used drugs as an example. Anything a person decides to put into their body should be their decision, and no one else's, especially not the government's. Ross's fascination with libertarianism continued, and he participated in a debate about whether drugs should be legalised or not. Ross defended the position that every person should have the free will to decide whether to take drugs. He said that many problems would stop if drugs were legalised, such as violence and turf wars, and the issue of poor quality drugs being cut with poison and dangerous chemicals. Ross's belief was that if drugs were legal, it would be safer for everyone. After graduating from university, Ross decided that he had no interest in pursuing a career in science. What he wanted to do was become an entrepreneur and develop his own business. For a couple of years, he'd been thinking of ways to put his libertarianism ideals into action. The closest he'd come was the design of a seastead, a permanent dwelling based at sea, outside the regulation of any government. As much as he liked the idea, it would be hard to turn into a reality. But Ross found a workaround. He'd always been a keen computer user. Even when he decided to live a less materialistic life, he always had his laptop close by. Most of his income came from computer-generated work. He'd searched for odd jobs on Craigslist, and he'd entered a partnership with a friend to run a used book website called Goodwagon Books. Ross was always on his laptop, and it was through his computer that he found a way to turn his seastead idea into reality. At the end of 2009, Ross started talking with someone online that had the pseudonym Arto. Ross found Arto on a forum on a libertarian website, and they started chatting via email. Ross wondered if he could create his free trade market idea on the internet and make it untraceable, outside the control and regulations of the government. He discussed his idea with Arto, and Arto told him that there was a way to create a website that couldn't be traced by the government, and the way to do it was through Tor. Tor allows you to enter the deep web. The deep web is essentially the internet in its entirety. The deep web is a part of the internet that is difficult to access. No one really knows how much content is available in the deep web, but a lot remains hidden there. You can't use a search engine to get there, you can't use a normal web browser, and you can't just type in a normal web address. In order to access the deep web, you do it through Tor, which is software that works as a web browser. Tor was originally created by the US Navy. Its function was to protect communication inside the government. They wanted a way to communicate that couldn't be traced, so Tor was created. As Arto explained to Ross, Tor provides anonymity. Once you enter Tor, you can't be traced because your IP address and browsing history are hidden. An IP address is basically the identity of your computer. Whenever you connect to the internet, your computer is given a unique IP address. If someone knows your IP address, then you can be uniquely identified, and it may be possible to determine your location. When you enter the deep web, you need to know where you are going. It isn't like browsing Google. It helps if you know the exact name and address of the site where you want to go. And they aren't regular web addresses either. Almost every site in the deep web uses mostly a random set of letters and numbers for its address, so it complicates matters even further. Whilst the deep web has a reputation for being a place only used by hackers, hitmen, and child pornographers, there are many legitimate reasons for its use. Some of those are privacy, to avoid websites giving your data away to marketing companies. People living in countries whose governments censor the internet can use it. Journalists use it to speak to sources and whistleblowers to assure anonymity. Ross thought the deep web sounded like the perfect place to create an anonymous website for his free trade marketplace idea. But he still had a problem. Even if he created a website where every person that entered was untraceable, he still needed an anonymous way of paying. If people had to pay with credit cards or PayPal, they could be easily traced, and the whole point would be lost. Ross asked Ardo about this. Ardo couldn't provide him with a straight-up solution, but he did tell him a story. The story was the plot of a novel called A Lodging of Wayfaring Men. In the novel, there is a group of libertarians that want complete freedom from the government, so they create a virtual society and create their own digital currency. The online society grows quickly, to the point where the government becomes afraid that the virtual society will destroy the norms of the actual society they live in. Ross found the story interesting and inspiring, but he didn't know how to create his own digital currency. It wasn't long until he found his solution, though. Almost at the same time that Ross was having these discussions with Ardo about the deep web, Bitcoin was being created. Bitcoin is a decentralised cryptocurrency, a digital currency that exists only online. Like Ross, the creator of Bitcoin, someone going by the name or pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto, wanted to get the banks and the government out of the way so that people could freely make transfers of money with one another. Nakamoto started working on the creation of Bitcoin in 2007, and in 2008, the US suffered its biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Wall Street crashed, and the banks essentially lost everything, collapsing completely. Shortly after that happened, Satoshi Nakamoto declared that a new currency was coming. Nakamoto posted on an online forum on February 11, 2009, on the Peer-to-Peer Foundation website. Quote, "The root problem with conventional currency is all the trust that's required to make it work. The central bank must be trusted not to debase the currency. But the history of fiat currencies is full of breaches of that trust. Banks must be trusted to hold our money and transfer it electronically, but they lend it out in waves of credit bubbles with barely a fraction in reserve. We have to trust them with our privacy, trust them not to let identity thieves drain our accounts. Their massive overhead costs make micropayments impossible." Nakamoto said that Bitcoin would solve all of these problems. The transfer of Bitcoin is made between one person and another. No third participant or central figure is required to control it. There are no taxes and no credits. Nakamoto's idea from the beginning was to make something straightforward, a transfer without all the hassles that most currencies have nowadays. A transfer that would be as simple as a person having something and giving it to another. Bitcoin managed to be exactly that. Bitcoin was exactly what Ross needed. Not only was Bitcoin created with similar ideals as his own, but it worked in a straightforward way. A person could buy Bitcoins and manage them anonymously. It's sort of like cash for the internet. It's hard to trace cash back to the person who spent it. When Bitcoin first appeared in 2010, Ross had been working tirelessly in the creation of his website for almost a year. He taught himself programming and coding and made the website from scratch. He didn't want anyone else to know about the site, because the first thing he wanted to sell there was drugs. The only person he'd shared anything with up to that moment was Richard, a friend of his from the University of Texas. Richard was a programmer, and even though Ross had tried to learn as much as possible, he was only self-taught. So when he got stuck with coding, he called Richard. When he shared the coding with Richard, he told him it was for a top-secret project, and he didn't want any questions asked about it. Richard respected the request and simply fixed the problem, having no idea what it was for. Ross did eventually share his website with his girlfriend, Julia. After they started their relationship at Penn State University, Ross and Julia remained together through thick and thin. Julia didn't share Ross's passion for libertarianism, but she respected his views. When Ross finished his master's degree and decided to become an entrepreneur, Julia left Penn State with him, and together they rented an apartment in Austin, Texas, his hometown. While Ross did several jobs, Julia had her own photography business, Vivian's Muse. Their apartment was her photography studio. In November 2010, Ross blindfolded Julia. She didn't understand what was happening, but allowed him to take her. He led her to his pickup truck, and they drove for a while before coming to a stop. Ross led Julia by her shoulders, and when he finally took off her blindfold, all she saw was darkness. She realised the only source of light was a small window, and the place seemed small and had a strong odour. Julia was confused, but soon understood what was going on when Ross showed her a large shelf that had long trays of mushrooms. Magic mushrooms. Ross showed her each of the trays and explained that this was the place he'd been disappearing to recently. The place was a small apartment he rented that was downstairs from the landlord's house. Ross was able to rent it without too many questions getting asked. He said he couldn't keep it to himself any longer. He had to tell someone, and the blindfold was for Julia's own protection. What he was planning was big, and if he got caught, he didn't want her involved. After testing the quality of his mushrooms, Ross felt it was time. In January 2011, the website was ready to launch. He'd done the coding, the programming, the design, and he'd created the first product to sell. The choice of mushrooms to be the first thing to sell wasn't a surprising one. Ross was a pro-drug advocate. His drugs of choice were marijuana, acid, and psychedelics, and he believed that if he was caught selling mushrooms, he would receive a lesser penalty than if he was caught dealing heroin or cocaine. The last thing Ross needed for his website was a name. At one point he was leaning towards underground brokers, but at the last moment he had a change of heart and went for a name that described not only the market, but also emphasised the ideas behind it. That name was Silk Road. When Ross launched the website, he shared it with only one person, his girlfriend, Julia. He'd already showed her the magic mushrooms and had given her a very quick summary of the website's idea. So when he opened the site for business, it made sense to show it to Julia. He trusted her. As outlined in the book American Kingpin by Nick Bilton, Ross gave Julia a step-by-step guide on how to enter Silk Road. Once they had Tor downloaded on Julia's MacBook, Ross typed in the following address: tydgccyk-ixpb-u6uz.onion. This was Silk Road's web address. Because it was on the deep web, it was a bunch of random letters and numbers and ended with .onion instead of .com. Now that they were inside Silk Road, Ross allowed Julia time to take it all in. She saw the website was mostly a blank page with the name Silk Road written in green, along with the green logo of a camel. The camel was a reference to the actual Silk Road. Merchants would travel through the Silk Road routes on camels because many were located in deserts and places with very dry weather. But other than seeing that, Julia wasn't too sure how to navigate the website, so Ross continued explaining. Ross acted like a regular buyer and went to one of the links inside the site that read drugs. Once inside the drugs classification, there was another link that read psychedelics. Ross clicked on that link, and there were his magic mushrooms, the first and only product available on Silk Road at that point. There was a picture showing what they looked like and the price. Julia asked Ross how she would go about buying the mushrooms, and Ross explained Bitcoin. He gave her the example of buying tokens in an arcade. He told her she'd go to the arcade and pay for tokens, which she could then use to play in the arcade, and there would be no way of knowing which tokens she used. Julia understood the concept, but wasn't sure where to buy Bitcoin, so Ross went to a Bitcoin exchange site and asked for her credit card. He entered her details, and just like that, she had Bitcoins to use. The explanation seemed simple enough to Julia, but she'd received a guided explanation from Ross, the creator of the site. So her next question was, how would anyone else who entered the site know what to do? Ross showed her a how-to step-by-step guide that he'd written for that purpose, so that buyers and sellers wouldn't get lost. The last question on Julia's mind was, how would anyone else know about the existence of Silk Road? Ross answered Julia by showing her 2 posts he'd written on different sites. first one was a post he'd written on January 27, 2011. He'd gone to a magic mushrooms forum called The Shroomery and registered an account under the pseudonym Altoid. After registering, he posted the following message. Quote, I came across this website called Silk Road. It's a Tor hidden service that claims to allow you to buy and sell anything online anonymously. I'm thinking of buying off it, but wanted to see if anyone here had heard of it and could recommend it. I found it through silkroad420.wordpress.com, which if you have a Tor browser, directs you to the real site. Let me know what you think. Ross played the part of being someone who was casually browsing the deep web and came across the site by accident, so he wouldn't be known as the creator. But at the same time, he left every piece of information one needed to enter Silk Road. As outlined in the book Silk Road by Eileen Ormsby, the link to the WordPress site that he created located on the regular internet redirected people to the actual link in the deep web for anyone using a Tor browser. In the WordPress site he created, Ross used the name Silk Road 420. The number 420 refers to April 20th, the official day of marijuana. When a person entered the WordPress site, a message appeared saying, "This is not Silk Road, but you are close." Then there was a guide on how to download Tor and access the actual Silk Road site on the deep web. Ross made a second web post about Silk Road 2 days later, January 29th, 2011. This second post was on a website called bitcointalk.org. Bitcoin was very new at this point, and people were discussing the viability of it and its possible uses. One use that seemed attractive was to pay for things on the deep web. The particular forum thread that Ross posted in was a discussion about using Bitcoin to buy and sell heroin. Ross's post read, quote, "What an awesome thread. You guys have a ton of great ideas. Has anyone seen Silk Road yet? It's kind of like an anonymous Amazon.com. I don't think they have heroin there, but they are selling other stuff. They basically use Bitcoin and Tor to broker anonymous transactions. Those not familiar with Tor can go to silkroad420.wordpress.com for instructions on how to access the .onion site. Let me know what you guys think." These two forum posts by Ross attracted people to Silk Road on its opening day. However, no one bought anything. But it wasn't long before they were. Soon, not only were people visiting Silk Road to buy and sell, they themselves were promoting the site. Chatter started to appear on forums and even on one online radio show. On the radio show, the host stated that 28 transactions had occurred on Silk Road in the first 2 weeks. There were 30 listings of different drugs and 151 registered users. Silk Road continued to grow, and less than 1 month later, on April 11, 2011, the number of registered users had grown to 1,000. The way a transaction was made was that the buyer would enter Silk Road, see the products available and choose what they wanted. They'd add it to a cart, exactly like you would on any normal website like Amazon. Then the buyer would check out and make their purchase. Once the purchase was made, the funds of the buyer would be retained by Silk Road in an escrow account until the buyer was satisfied with the purchase. Once the drugs got to the buyer's house or other place of choice, they released the funds from the escrow account to the seller. The way Silk Road made money was by acting as the third person in the transaction. Because the transaction was made through Silk Road and the funds were retained for the safety of both buyer and seller, Silk Road charged a commission for its services. At the time, the commission was 6.23% per transaction. One of the biggest breakthroughs Silk Road achieved was allowing people to get drugs delivered to their home, like any other online purchase. Each seller had a different method of hiding drugs so they wouldn't get detected by the authorities. Some were much better at it than others. Ross's method for his magic mushrooms was to first wrap them up in a plastic Ziploc bag. Then he put a second wrapping on them from his Good Wagon Books online store, so the drug delivery was disguised as a book. Lastly, he'd print out the name and address of the buyer rather than handwrite it. He believed this would look more businesslike and professional, and thus would attract less attention. By April 2011, Ross was starting to make money. In order to get Silk Road running, including the creation of the magic mushrooms, the rent of the apartment to grow them, the cost of creating the website and everything in between, Ross had invested $17,000. He'd now made that money back and had earned a few extra thousand on top. Julia was getting worried about the growth of the site. She was keeping an eye on it and noticed that some sellers were starting to sell hard drugs. During the first few weeks of operation, sellers offered mostly marijuana and psychedelics, like Ross himself was doing with his mushrooms. But now, sellers were starting to offer speed, cocaine and heroin. Julia believed that the consequences for Ross would now be much more severe if something happened to one of Silk Road's users, or if he was caught by the authorities. The book American Kingpin details an argument Julia had with Ross. She asked, "What if someone overdoses?" Ross answered, "We have a rating system, so if someone sells bad drugs, they get a bad rating and no one will buy from them again." Ross was referring to a new feature he just added to Silk Road. When people bought or sold, they got good or bad feedback, just like eBay. Julia responded, "How are they supposed to give someone a bad rating if they are dead?" Julia also raised her concern about who was actually visiting the website. Neither her nor Ross expected Silk Road to grow as fast as it had, and it was only getting bigger by the day. Users were discussing Silk Road non-stop. The discussions had grown from Bitcoin forums and moved to websites like 4chan and Reddit. At the end of May 2011, journalist Adrian Chen stumbled across several of these posts. Chen wrote for Gawker, a well-known New York-based blogging and news media site. The site's main tagline was, "Today's gossip is tomorrow's news." As detailed in the book Silk Road by Eileen Ormsby, Chen was on the Bitcoin Talk forum when he stumbled across a number of posts talking about Silk Road. At this point, Bitcoin advocates were worried that Silk Road was giving Bitcoin a bad name, as it was being promoted as the currency to pay for drugs on the dark web. The more Adrian Chen read, the more skeptical he became. He found it hard to believe that there was a website where drugs could be sold so comfortably online. It seemed too easy. Chen decided to follow the steps to enter Silk Road, and as he browsed through the site, he saw that there were exactly 343 different listings of drugs, with all sorts of variations. The prices varied as well. There were drugs that were very expensive, others that were the same as street-level prices, and others that were cheaper. Chen believed there was definitely potential for a story, but he still remained skeptical. He wanted to talk to someone who had actually bought drugs from the site. He posted a message on the Bitcoin Talk forum stating he was going to write a story on Silk Road, and he wanted to interview someone who had bought drugs there. Several people responded to Adrian's post detailing their experiences using Silk Road, but he also got a response he wasn't expecting. He got a response from Ross. Ross never revealed his true identity. He made a new account on the Bitcoin Talk forum under the name Silk Road to message Chen. Ross asked Chen to hold off on the story because Silk Road wanted to get bigger, but wasn't ready for the attention quite yet. Chen said he couldn't hold off. The story was going to be written now. Unable to get the story shut down, Ross decided to contribute to it. He said that he was very proud of Silk Road and its community, and he believed Silk Road was definitely making the purchase of drugs safer. He ended with the following quote: "The state is the primary source of violence, oppression, theft, and all forms of coercion. Stop funding the state with your tax dollars and direct your productive energies into the black market." At 4:20 p.m. on June 1st, 2011, Adrian Chen's article was published on Gawker.com. The title of the article was "The Underground Website Where You Can Buy Any Drug Imaginable." As an opener, Chen wrote, "Making small talk with your pot dealer sucks. Buying cocaine can get you shot. What if you could buy and sell drugs online like books or light bulbs? Now you can. Welcome to Silk Road." Chen included photos of the various drugs available and screenshots of the website itself. The article exploded. It was read by millions. According to many, it was Chen's article that brought Silk Road to the masses. One of the people who read the article was New York Senator Chuck Schumer. Within 3 days of Chen's article being released, Senator Schumer gave a press conference to address Silk Road. He was filmed sitting in front of a computer visiting Silk Road himself, pointing at the pictures of the drugs for sale and naming them. Senator Schumer, quote, "Literally, it allows buyers and users to sell illegal drugs online, including heroin, cocaine, and meth. And users sell by hiding their identities through a program that makes them virtually untraceable. It's a certifiable one-stop shop for illegal drugs that represents the most brazen attempt to peddle drugs online that we have ever seen. It's more brazen than anything else by light years. By cracking down on the website immediately, we can help stop these drugs from flooding our streets. Today I'm calling on the DEA and the Department of Justice to immediately shut down this site before more damage is done." The other person who gave a public statement was Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, who also called for the website to be shut down immediately. Both senators joined forces and wrote a letter directed at US Attorney General Eric Holder, who managed the Department of Justice and the DEA. In response, Ross gave a public statement of his own. In the Silk Road forums, which had existed since the beginning of the site, Ross posted a message under the name admin, which was how all Silk Road users knew him. No one knew his actual identity, just that he was admin. The message read, quote, "As many of you know, US senators are aware of the site and aiming to take it down. The die have been cast, and now we will see how they land. We'll be diverting even more effort into countering their attacks and making the site as resilient as possible, which means we may not be as responsive to messages for a while. I'm sure this news will scare some off, but should we win the fight, a new era will be born. Even if we lose, the genie is out of the bottle and they are fighting a losing war already. It's better to live one day as a lion than 100 years as a lamb." Ross sounded encouraging and fearless on the site, but things were different in real life. The Gawker article and the subsequent public statements by 2 US senators brought a lot more attention to Silk Road. In a few days, the number of registered users on the site jumped from 1,000 to 10,000, and the forums were filled with endless posts. Many users who were already using the site were pissed off at Adrian Chen's article because Silk Road was supposed to be an underground secret. Ross was also having problems with Bitcoin. Every time there was a new purchase on the site, he lost Bitcoins out of his own account, and he had no idea why. He was also concerned that the servers wouldn't be able to handle the increased traffic to the website. So he decided to do what the senators had asked. He shut Silk Road down. It happened on June 9th, 8 days after the Gawker article was published. Ross started checking all of the coding and programming he'd done until he found what the problem was. When he designed Silk Road, he had connected his own Bitcoin account to the interface of the website. In order to fix this, he rewrote the code, and he was able to stop his Bitcoins from disappearing every time there was a new purchase. Because of the fact Ross was so inexperienced and hadn't done programming or coding before, he realised there was a number of other potential problems on the site that had to be fixed as well. He reopened Silk Road on June 17th, but disabled the possibility for any new registrations. This gave him time to fix the other mistakes in his programming and coding. Existing members of Silk Road took advantage and sold their memberships off at different forums. They went to Reddit, 4chan and Bitcoin Talk and offered their Silk Road seller accounts to whoever bid the most. On June 26th, Ross reopened registrations on Silk Road, but he made a change. The seller accounts were now put up for auction. Previously, a user could simply purchase a seller account for $500, but now the seller accounts were auctioned off, one every 48 hours to the highest bidder. Ross released a post on the site to explain this change, saying that he hoped it would mean only the most professional and dedicated sellers would have access to seller accounts. The auctions generated a lot of action, and Silk Road continued to grow. With the release of the Gawker article and all of the attention it brought, things started to turn for the worse between Ross and his girlfriend Julia. When his Bitcoin account started draining due to the coding problem, Ross didn't leave his computer. In fact, he had barely left his computer at all since Silk Road launched. He dedicated a lot of time to his website and a very little time to anything else. Then things got worse for Julia. Ross showed her a new product on Silk Road. A seller had introduced guns. Julia completely disagreed with guns being available to buy on Silk Road. She couldn't think of any good reasons why someone would want to buy a gun anonymously. Ross believed in a person's right to defend themselves and believed that if the government could have guns, then so too should the people. Communication between the couple lessened until Julia decided to leave for a few days to visit her friend Erica in New York. Julia couldn't stop thinking about Ross and Silk Road. It plagued her thoughts to such an extent that she ended up telling her friend Erica about the site. Erica swore she'd never tell anyone about it. Julia returned to Austin in the beginning of September 2011. She gave Ross an ultimatum: her or Silk Road. He chose Silk Road. He moved into a new apartment in Austin, but still remained on relatively good terms with Julia. They still saw each other occasionally. After the breakup, Julia invited her friend Erica to move to Austin and live with her. Erica made the move, but the living arrangements didn't last long. Erica and Julia wanted to score some acid for a night out, so they went to a place where they knew they could get it easily: Silk Road. Erica had a really bad trip which landed her in hospital. Julia didn't go with her, and when Erica got out, her and Julia had a huge fight. Ross happened to be at Julia's apartment visiting at the time, and he got in between them. He ended up grabbing Erica and pushing her out of the apartment. Erica returned to New York, and the next morning, Ross checked his Facebook account. There was a post on his wall from Erica that read, "I'm sure the authorities would like to know about Ross Ulbricht's drug website." Ross panicked and deleted the message as fast as he could. He called Erica and told her that he was very sorry for what had happened. He was in tears and pleaded with her not to tell anyone else. Erica agreed and then hung up on him. Ross was angry. He told Julia that she had betrayed his trust, and now he had to leave Austin because of her. Ross sold his pickup truck and then got as far away from Austin as he could. He went to Bondi in Sydney, Australia. As Silk Road's creator Ross Ulbricht was leaving Austin headed for Sydney, Australia, a new person started lurking on Silk Road. It all started in June 2011, around the same time that the Gawker article came out. A Customs and Border Protection officer that worked at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago was going through the mail when he came across an envelope that had a pill of ecstasy inside. Most officers would have seized the pill, filed a report, and not much more would have come of it. Investigations were costly, and time and resources wouldn't be committed to a single ecstasy pill. There would need to be a lot more pills for the case to be taken seriously. But this particular customs officer decided to call the Homeland Security Investigation Team in Chicago. The Homeland Security officer that answered the call was Jared Deryagian. What most Homeland Security officers would do if called about a single pill of ecstasy found in the mail would be to say, "Tell someone who cares." But Jared was very new at his job. He'd only been at it for a few months, so he listened to what the customs officer had to say. It turned out that the ecstasy pill was just passing through Chicago. It was actually headed for Minneapolis, 400 miles away. So if Jared investigated that single pill, he'd have to travel all the way to Minneapolis to speak to the person the mail was addressed to. Jared thanked the customs officer for the call, but explained he couldn't travel to Minneapolis for one pill. However, He did tell him to call him again if a pill or any other drug came through the mail that was actually headed for Chicago. This happened 4 months later, on October 5th, 2011. The Customs and Border Protection officer came across a small envelope that had the name and address printed from a computer. Ross had always believed that printing names and addresses from a computer looked more businesslike and less suspicious than handwriting them. But on this occasion, it was actually the reason the Border Protection officer thought the envelope looked suspicious. It was only a small envelope, and normally envelopes of that size had the name and address handwritten, so that's what got the officer's attention initially. Then he saw the envelope came from the Netherlands, a country known for drugs. Lastly, when he felt the envelope, he felt a small bump. He filed a report that authorised him to open the envelope, and inside, he found a pink ecstasy pill, just like he had 4 months earlier. But this time, the pill's destination was Chicago. So the customs officer called Jared from Homeland Security again. Jared drove to O'Hare Airport and seized the pill. In order to attend the address the pill was headed to, he'd have to go with his supervisor. Since Jared was so new at his job, he was assigned a supervisor to watch over him for the first year. The supervisor authorised the visit, and a week later they drove to the address where the pill was headed, on the north side of Chicago. They knocked on the door and a young man answered. Jared asked for David, since that's who the envelope was addressed to. The young man said David was his roommate and he was at work. Jared pulled out the envelope with the pill and showed David's roommate. The roommate told Jared that he knew about the pills. He said they came from a website, Silk Road. Jared had never heard of Silk Road, and he asked the roommate what it was. The roommate gave a basic explanation of the site and how it worked. He said they had purchased marijuana, meth, and ecstasy from it in the past. Jared left the house confused. He didn't understand how such a website could exist. He returned to the office and searched for open cases on Silk Road, but he found none. He then typed Silk Road into Google to see what he could find. He found the Gawker article and read all about it. He also found instructions on how to enter Silk Road. The site fascinated and petrified Jared at the same time. He couldn't stop thinking about it, and a few days later he made a decision. He was going to build a case against Silk Road. He went to his supervisor and presented him with an idea. He knew that a single pill would never be taken seriously. But what if he collected a large amount of drugs? Then it would have to be taken seriously. Jared's supervisor allowed him to take on Silk Road as a side project, so Jared started collecting drugs. He went to see the Customs and Border Protection officer at O'Hare Airport and asked him to keep every single envelope that had drugs inside. Every night, Jared drove to the airport and collected whatever drugs had been found. In about 2 months, he had 100 envelopes. At the end of November 2011, Jared felt he had enough to make a case, and together with his supervisor, they met with an assistant US attorney in Chicago. The following is detailed in the book American Kingpin by Nick Bilton. Jared entered the office, opened a backpack, and threw 30 envelopes onto the floor. The assistant US attorney just looked at him, confused. Jared picked up each envelope and placed them on the desk. This one had LSD, this one had amphetamines, this one ketamine, this one heroin. The assistant US attorney was astonished that all of those drugs had been bought online and then delivered through the mail. But still, he thought there might be bigger fish to fry. Jared was ready for that response and had prepared a speech. Jared said, "This isn't about the drugs. This isn't about that one little pill. This is about the site overall and what it stands for. It's about how the people on this site are using our internet, built by the United States government, to run an anonymous web browser, also built by the United States government, and they are using the United States postal system to circumvent the laws of our country, and there's nothing we can do to stop them. This is just the beginning. It's drugs now, but could be used for terrorism next. Imagine a worst-case scenario where a group like Al-Qaeda uses the site, or the exact same setup, to coordinate attacks against America, all with tools built by the United States." The words sunk in with the assistant US attorney, and after a moment of consideration, he told Jared that yes, he could do it. He could open a case on Silk Road. Jared made his plan, and that December he got into Silk Road and registered an account. He started what he called profiling. His ultimate goal was to find out who ran Silk Road, but in order to reach that person, he had to first start with the community. To begin with, he decided he would pose as a buyer and purchase drugs. By doing this, he expected two things. One was that he would be able to start profiling sellers by identifying their listings on the site, their communication through messages, and their packaging techniques. And second, he would be able to gauge how much drug trafficking actually occurred on Silk Road. After completing a lot of paperwork to get authorization to buy drugs, Jared was given $1,000. He went online to a Bitcoin exchange and traded the dollars for Bitcoins. He bought a total of 18 different drugs from 18 different sellers in 6 different countries, including ecstasy, opium tea, and synthetic marijuana. Jared had the drugs delivered to a secret post office box at O'Hare Airport. He knew the drugs were sent through the mail, but he didn't know how many packages actually made it to their destination. After he made his purchases, Jared got his answer. Out of the 18 packages that he bought, only one was intercepted by Customs and Border Protection. Another package never arrived, and the other 16 were safely waiting for him in his post office box. Before he left Austin and headed to Bondi, Ross Ulbricht had to take care of a loose end. Richard. Richard was his friend from the University of Texas, who he had called to help with the programming and coding of Silk Road in the very beginning. Ross had refused to tell him what the programming and coding was for. Richard agreed to help and didn't ask any questions. But when Ross asked him for more help, Richard refused. He said he wasn't going to help him anymore unless he knew what the project was. Ross couldn't handle the coding and programming on his own, so he had no choice. He told Richard about Silk Road. Richard found it interesting and agreed to continue helping. Ross gave him drugs as payment for his services, and Richard also bought drugs on his own from Silk Road. But after a while, Richard started to fear the consequences of being caught, and he stopped helping. Ross knew Richard was a loose end, and he paid him a visit before leaving for Australia. He told Richard about Erica's move to Austin, the fight that happened with Julia, and the post Erica had written on his Facebook wall. Richard's fear increased tenfold after hearing that, and he asked Ross to shut Silk Road down. He told him it wasn't worth going to prison for. But Ross told Richard he couldn't shut it down, because he'd given Silk Road to someone else. He didn't run it anymore. He was lying. Silk Road was still his. But this was his idea of tying up the loose end, pretending he no longer ran the website. Since everyone's identity on Silk Road was anonymous, he told Richard he didn't even know who the new owner was. Richard believed him, and Ross then made the move to Australia. Ross lived in Bondi with his sister. He continued to manage Silk Road under the cover of doing online freelance work and day trading, so people weren't suspicious as to why he was always on his computer. It was while living in Australia that he was contacted by a new user on Silk Road. Ross had people who helped him with the Silk Road forums as moderators, and he had new programmers he had found on the site working for him as well. But he still had a lot of problems and security breaches, and it took one person to point them all out. Ross was contacted by someone who called themselves Variety Jones. He told Ross that he stumbled upon Silk Road after reading the Gawker article. He found it hard to believe that such a website could exist without being seized by authorities. So he made his way into the Silk Road servers, like a hacker would, and he checked the files of the site to make sure it wasn't actually being run by law enforcement. Variety Jones's suspicion was that if the site hadn't been seized, then perhaps it was a trick by the police or the DEA. But when hacking the site, he discovered it was actually genuine, so that led him to contact Ross, or Silk Road's administrator, as Variety Jones knew him. When he first introduced himself, Variety Jones said, "There isn't anyone who knows me even a little bit that would ever dream of crossing me. If they did dream of it, they would wake up and call to apologise. This got Ross's attention. The first matter Variety Jones wanted to address was the security of Silk Road. Ross already knew security was his biggest weakness, and he was more than eager to listen to what Variety Jones had to say. But before he got into security, Variety Jones wanted to make sure Ross knew what he was dealing with. He said, "Not to be a downer or anything, but understand what we are doing falls under US drug kingpin laws, which provides a maximum penalty of death upon conviction. The mandatory minimum is life." Ross had done his own research and already knew what was at stake, so his answer to Variety Jones was, "Balls to the wall and all in, my friend." And with that, the two men formed a friendship, even though they had no idea who the other person really was. Variety Jones gave Ross all sorts of advice and acted almost like a mentor. He seemed to have far more experience and knowledge in almost everything than Ross. Their conversations were recorded in chat logs and are highlighted in the book American Kingpin. Ross asked Variety Jones, "What are my strengths?" Jones answered, "You play your cards close. You really do get that it's gone from fun and games to a very serious life or death lifestyle you've created." Ross then asked, "What are my weaknesses?" Jones answered, "Your inability to discern between a garter snake and a copperhead, and the gaping holes in your knowledge of security." Ross didn't understand the reference about the snake, so Jones explained, "Recognising something is dangerous when you think it's harmless." At first, Ross and Variety Jones talked every few days, then every few hours, then every few minutes. Variety Jones was soon making joint decisions with Ross regarding Silk Road, and he slowly started to ask about his personal life. In one instance, he asked Ross, "In real life, is there anyone with a clue at all that you, whoever you are, started the Silk Road? Girlfriend, boyfriend, bunny you talk to, online buddies who you've known for years, grandma, priest, rabbi, stripper?" Ross's reply was, "Unfortunately, yes. There are two. One person I'll probably never speak to again, and the other I'll drift away from, never making the mistake of telling someone again." Some days after that conversation, Variety Jones came up with an answer to Ross's problem. He always seemed to know what to say and when to say it. He asked Ross, "Have you seen The Princess Bride?" The Princess Bride is a fantasy family-orientated film from 1987, based on a book by William Goldman. Ross said that he had seen it. Variety Jones said, "So you know the history of the Dread Pirate Roberts?" The Dread Pirate Roberts was a character in The Princess Bride. It wasn't one man, but a series of individuals who passed the name and reputation on to a chosen successor once they are wealthy enough to retire. And because of that, no one ever knew who the original Dread Pirate Roberts was. Variety Jones told Ross, "You need to change your name from admin to Dread Pirate Roberts." He said by doing so, Ross could maintain his story that he had given the site to someone else, and all he knew was that the person he gave it to went by the name Dread Pirate Roberts. Ross loved the idea, and on February 5th, 2012, Silk Road admin announced they were going by a new name, Dread Pirate Roberts. The name became a quick success. The Silk Road community understood the reference to The Princess Bride and believed that it was indeed a perfect name on so many levels. Most of Ross's employees, none of whom knew his real identity, started calling him Captain. One of his programmers told him, "We really can change the world. We are really lucky. This opportunity is on a scale of a few times in a millennia." All of his employees said that they had the same aim as Ross, to legalise drugs, and to ensure that future generations wouldn't spend their lives behind bars for selling or using drugs. 1 year after opening, Silk Road was continuing to grow at a rapid rate. In December 2011, drug sales totaled $500,000 per month. 3 months later, in March 2012, drug sales had increased to $500,000 per week. Ross was making a lot of money with his 6.23% commission. But not everything was perfect. There were problems in the community itself between buyers and sellers, involving lost packages and disputes with transactions. And it wasn't a secret that Silk Road security was lacking. On one occasion, a hacker stole $75,000 worth of bitcoins from the site. Ross struggled to keep calm. He had a few panic attacks, and he constantly bit his nails. He went on a holiday to Asia, but he told Variety Jones that he was unable to enjoy the trip at all. He had to constantly check on Silk Road no matter where he was, and Wi-Fi wasn't the best where he visited. Not only that, most of the places that had Wi-Fi were extremely busy, and Ross had a rule. If someone could peer over his shoulder, he would move location, so no one could see what he was doing. Something else that had added to his nerves was that some Asian countries had the death penalty for drug offences, so it wasn't a very relaxing holiday. Ross returned to Australia after a month in Asia, after which he had a discussion with Variety Jones about the money they were making. Variety Jones was estimating how much they would be making by the end of the year, but Ross interrupted him and said, "That money won't be worth much if we're behind bars." Variety Jones said that they needed to come up with a plan. One of the first things they decided had to happen was for Ross to lead a healthier lifestyle. He basically lived on his computer, so Variety Jones recommended that he take long walks, eat healthier meals, and have longer meditation times. Ross also decided to leave Australia and head back home. On April 10th, 2012, he returned to Austin, Texas. While Ross was returning to Texas, the investigation into Silk Road by Chicago-based Homeland Security Officer Jared Duryagian was going slower than he would have liked. He was working on profiling the sellers, but it wasn't easy. Every time an envelope with drugs was found by Customs and Border Protection, Jared would drive to O'Hare Airport to get it, no matter what time of day or night it was. Then he would photograph everything, fill out a seizure form, and stack it up in his office. By now, he had over 500 different envelopes, and he had pictures of the seized drugs stuck all over his walls. Once he seized a drug, he went on Silk Road and searched the drugs on display from each seller to see if he could match them to the drugs intercepted by Customs and Border Control. All of this took a long time, and on top of that, both sellers and buyers at Silk Road were getting smarter. When it came to buyers, many would use PGP encryption, which turns any text the person enters into an undecipherable block that can only be opened and seen by the person it's addressed to by using a private key. When it came to sellers, they used every imaginable trick to send a drug so they wouldn't be found. One seller put pills inside a hollow marker pen, another put cocaine inside hollowed out batteries, another put their drugs in the glue behind a shampoo sample inside a magazine. Heroin was often sent folded inside some sheets of A4 paper in an envelope disguised as coming from either a real estate agent, a bank, or a travel agent. It couldn't be detected when touched. As outlined in the book Silk Road by Eileen Ormsby, most packages got through customs, but some were intercepted. This was known to Silk Road sellers, and one of them slipped a note inside his envelopes which read, "If you are the intended recipient, please use responsibly. If you are law enforcement, go fuck yourself." Sellers on Silk Road had their own secret section in the forums called the Vendors Roundtable. In order to become a part of the Vendors Roundtable, a seller needed to have proven qualifications, which meant they required a good sales record over a certain period of time. In the Vendors Roundtable forum, sellers gave tips to one another on how to hide their drugs and which method worked best for what. They would also discuss ways to make sales more swiftly, and other things to make life easier for them all. They understood that they were competing with each other, but at the same time, they were also part of a community, and when one of them won, everyone won. So they didn't mind helping each other out. Another issue they discussed in the Vendors Roundtable was the presence of suspicious buyers. Buyers who threatened sellers requesting more drugs or they'd give bad feedback, and buyers who gave off what they called bad law enforcement vibes. Despite the fact that sellers helped each other out on the forum, they also took precautions. If a seller wanted to make a purchase of their own from Silk Road, they always created a separate buyer account. Although most Silk Road sellers respected one another, giving your address away to a fellow dealer was never a good idea. All in all, the Silk Road community was becoming more professional as it grew. It continued to generate more press as well. Since that first article appeared in Gawker 1 year earlier, Silk Road was now being covered repeatedly by networks such as NPR, ABC, and several others. Eileen Ormsby describes in her book Silk Road that a lot of journalists who visited the site were surprised at the discussions taking place on the forums. It wasn't filled with the dropkicks and trolls they were expecting. There were well thought out intellectual posts, discussions, debates, and even forum threads dedicated to charity. There were discussions about harm minimisation that a doctor participated in. There were posts from terminal cancer patients thanking the Dread Pirate Roberts for creating a place where they could get access to cannabis to help live out their days more peacefully. Posts from people who said their use of drugs was much safer now thanks to Silk Road. It was becoming a thriving community. It was by no means a place filled with just crackheads and criminals. Homeland Security Officer Jared Deryagian saw all of this, and he was worried about the slow progress of his investigation, while Silk Road was only getting bigger, brighter, and better by the day. He also worried that if more people were finding out about the site, then more law enforcement agencies would want to build a case to shut it down. And he wasn't wrong. There were already other agencies trying to build cases on Silk Road, as detailed in the book American Kingpin. Jared found out about it one afternoon in June 2012. He was sitting in his office going through some envelopes when he heard a beeping sound coming from his computer. It was a notification that someone was reading his case. When he checked who, he saw that it was 2 agents from the Homeland Security Office in Baltimore. Very soon after that, Jared's supervisor received an email saying that the Baltimore agents were travelling to Chicago to discuss the Silk Road case, and they were bringing their US attorney with them. Jared and his supervisor agreed to the meeting. The meeting didn't involve much of a discussion. The agents from Baltimore explained that they had turned a dealer who had given them a list of names that belonged to sellers on Silk Road. They planned to go after those sellers, and they were certain that one of the names they had belonged to the owner of Silk Road. Jared told the Baltimore agents they were making it sound way too easy. They had no idea what they were dealing with, and they had no respect for Tor or for Bitcoin. Jared was shut down by the US attorney from Baltimore, who told him that Baltimore would be leading the investigation, but he was welcome to help if he had something important to add. Jared's supervisor responded, "Here's what we're going to do. You guys are going to go your way, we're going to go our way, and we'll deconflict when we have to." Deconflict meant having a deconfliction meeting, which was a meeting with several representatives from the government who listened to all agencies involved in a case and then decided who got to lead it. The Baltimore team agreed, and both parties went their separate ways. Not before the Baltimore team said they were pretty sure they would have Silk Road shut down in a matter of weeks. But it turned out that the list of Silk Road sellers the Baltimore agents had was nothing more than a dead end. They did have something going for them though. Well, not something, someone. The Baltimore investigation had originally started in January 2012. The Baltimore Homeland Security Investigations team had their informant who gave them the list of sellers, but they weren't used to tackling drug-related cases, so they asked for help from the DEA. And the DEA offered them one of their agents, Carl Force. Most of Carl's work was done in an office. He'd done field work and worked undercover previously, but he developed a few bad habits along the way, including a drug habit. So he took some time off, and when he returned to work, he was put behind a desk. In January 2012, Carl's supervisor informed him that the Baltimore Homeland Security team were going to build a case against Silk Road, and he was asked to assist them. Carl had heard about Silk Road before, and he'd done some Google searches on it, which led him to the Gawker article written by Adrian Chen. Carl believed it was a huge case, but he had no specialised computer knowledge, so it wasn't something he could handle. But when the opportunity came up for him to assist Baltimore's Homeland Security team with the case, he jumped at it. One of the first things the Baltimore Homeland Security agents showed Carl was how to download Tor and how to access Silk Road. Once Carl was inside Silk Road, his interest grew further and further. Every day after work, he closed himself up in a spare room at home and he searched the site and read the forums to learn everything he could. The Baltimore Homeland Security team believed their best bet was to arrest dealers who were selling on Silk Road, and eventually that would lead them to the site's creator, the Dread Pirate Roberts. But Carl Force came up with his own plan. First, Carl Force created a fake identity and a backstory. The story he came up with was that he was originally from the Dominican Republic, and he knew people all over South America who could take care of trafficking drugs, laundering money, and any other dirty work. He earned $25 million per year smuggling coke and heroin into the United States. And with that backstory in mind, on April 21st, 2012, DEA agent Carl Force registered on Silk Road with the username Knob. The first thing Carl did when he registered was send the Dread Pirate Roberts a message. He said he was a great admirer of his work, and he then introduced himself using the backstory he had created. He said he believed Silk Road could be the future of drug trafficking, and he wanted to make a proposal. He wanted to buy the site. Carl Force didn't have authorization to do this. He'd gone rogue. When the Baltimore Homeland Security agents found out, they didn't approve, but there wasn't much they could do about it. The message was already sent. They just had to hope the Dread Pirate Roberts didn't suspect anything. Meanwhile, Ross Ulbricht, aka the Dread Pirate Roberts, was busy with a number of things unfolding on Silk Road. He put a new message on the site called the State of the Road Address, and it caused a problem. The State of the Road Address from the Dread Pirate Roberts mentioned the media attention Silk Road was getting. He said Silk Road was never meant to be private and exclusive. It was meant to grow and be a force to be reckoned with, so the attention was welcome, and the more people on the site, the more prosperity there would be. He called Silk Road a revolution and said how proud he was of it. He then mentioned the escrow system and the fact that some new members were being lured into trading outside of escrow and finalising early. This was being done to avoid paying the commission to Ross for sales on the site. A number of scams had been pulled off this way, so Ross had an idea to combat it. He announced that the flat 6.23% commission on all sales was gone. It was too high for transactions over $300, and that's what made trading outside of the escrow system so attractive. A seller who sold one ecstasy pill was being charged the same percentage as someone who sold a kilo of cocaine. So instead of the flat commission, Ross announced that Silk Road would now be scaling their commissions. Orders less than $50 had the highest commission at 10%, and orders over $1,000 had the lowest at 1.5%, and there were a number of other levels in between. Ross had come up with this new fee system in consultation with Variety Jones. They thought it made it fairer for everyone, but they didn't anticipate the extreme rage that came from many sellers. Soon after the State of the Road Address came out, a debate started on the forums. Some were okay with the change, but most people weren't. Most sellers on Silk Road didn't identify exclusively as small or big dealers. They simply adapted to the demand. If a buyer asked for a few pills, they could get them. If a buyer wanted a shitload of pills, many sellers could make arrangements to make that happen. But for the most part, Silk Road attracted recreational users, so most of the transactions were at the lower level, meaning they now attracted higher fees. That's why the new fee structure caused such an outrage. The Silk Road forums exploded with complaints. They also weren't happy with the fact that the Dread Pirate Roberts seemed to be so proud of how Silk Road was working, but then in the same message, he was declaring that the commissions were rising and more money would be taken out of sellers' pockets. It seemed like a contradicting message. The outrage on the forum continued until the Dread Pirate Roberts responded with this. To those of you that are either supportive of the change or have faith in what I'm doing regardless of whether you see the point or not, thank you for your support. I've done everything I can to earn that trust, and I cherish it. To those of you chalking my actions up to pure greed and ignoring the context for the changes, I say shame on you. When have I lied? When have I cheated or stolen from anyone here? When have I treated anyone unfairly? When have I led you astray? Why do you turn on me now when I have poured my heart and soul into this community and project? 10% on $50 orders. We're talking about an extra $1.88. A $10 order, an extra 38 cents. Do you think this site built itself? Do you think it runs itself? Do you have any clue what goes on behind the scenes to keep this going? Do you have any idea the risk the people operating this site are taking? Do you have any clue what we've been through to get here today? Do you have any clue what it's going to take to get through the next year? Whether you like it or not, I'm the captain of the ship. If you don't like the rules of the game, or you don't trust your captain, you can get off the boat. It took some time, but most people accepted this message and went on with their sales. It wasn't like business was struggling. Some sellers were pulling in $20,000 per month. Some claimed to be making over $4,000 per day. Despite most sellers copying the new fees on the chin and getting on with it, Ross could sense the matter wasn't over. He shared his thoughts with Variety Jones in April 2012, telling him, "I suspect that several are talking about making backup plans to jump ship or create competing sites. I don't want a mutiny." At this point, Variety Jones was handling most of Silk Road's programmers and was essentially second in command. He told Ross he'd mingle with both buyers and sellers to see what the general feeling was, and to see if there was any talk of a mutiny. At the same time, Ross thought it would be a good idea to run a promotion. He called it the Great 420 Sale and Giveaway. On April 20th, 2012, the world's official Marijuana Day, the biggest ever Silk Road sale occurred. The sale started at 4:20 p.m. on Friday, April 20th, and ended at 5:20 p.m. on Sunday, April 22nd. For those 49 hours, a buyer could win a prize every 420 seconds, 420 prizes in total. The big prize was a trip for two for 12 days with $2,000 included for expenses. Every time a person made a purchase, they would earn a ticket to be added to the draw for the big prize. So essentially, the more drugs you bought, the more chances you had of winning a holiday. In addition, Ross added a 10% discount on every product. This was made possible as Ross didn't charge commission for the duration of the sale, and he encouraged sellers to pass that saving on to the buyers. One seller in particular was very excited about the sale. He went by the name Tony76. Tony76 had the greatest reputation out of all the sellers on Silk Road. His reviews and ratings were constantly 100% positive. No one ever complained. He was also very helpful and polite to everyone on the site. When the Great 420 Sale and Giveaway came, Tony76 announced several benefits. First, he offered discounts far larger than 10%. Second, he was opening up his products to international buyers. Previously, he'd only sold to US buyers. And third, he started the sale early, 24 hours before the official launch. He only had one condition, which he outlined in the following message. "I can't afford to have so much money tied up in escrow and have it affect my ability to reload on product. If you're uncomfortable finalising early, I completely understand, but it's not optional for this order, and I advise you to not order." Tony76 was doing what the Dread Pirate Roberts explicitly told people not to do. Tony wanted people to deal outside the escrow system and pay him before they got their drugs. In other circumstances, buyers would have found this proposal suspicious. But it wasn't the first time that Tony76 had requested this, and everything had gone smoothly on those previous occasions. He had an impeccable reputation, and people were happy to finalise early with him. Tony76 thrived during the sale. He was the #1 seller by far. In fact, he sold so many drugs that on April 25th, he released a message for all buyers that he would be taking his listings down in 12 hours' time so he could catch up on the sale orders. So if you wanted something, you had to get in quick. Buyers scrambled to get their orders in on time from one of the most trusted sellers on Silk Road. It's estimated that Tony 76 made $250,000 in that one weekend of the sale. But no one ever got their drugs. Tony 76 had used Silk Road's biggest sale to play the biggest scam anyone on the site had ever pulled off. When buyers complained, the response from the Dread Pirate Roberts was short and concise. He explained that Silk Road's escrow system avoided scams like this, and it was the buyer's decision to disrespect that system. Therefore, no one was getting refunded. Meanwhile, Variety Jones got back to Ross with some info. He had done some digging and spoken to several people, and it seemed Ross's fears were real. There was talk of mutiny. Sellers weren't sure what they were going to do yet, but they had 3 options in mind. One was to leave Silk Road and move to Black Market Reloaded, a new site that had emerged that followed the same idea as Silk Road, but without any libertarian ideals behind it. Also, it was truly underground. It hadn't made the mainstream press yet, and the owner seemed more than happy to keep it under the radar. The second option being considered was for sellers to build their own site to compete with Silk Road. And the third option was to hack into Silk Road and take over full command of it. The option that scared Ross the most was the third one. He knew that security was still Silk Road's main issue. And it was right at this time that Ross received the message from a new user called Knob offering to buy the site. Knob was the account DEA agent Carl Force had created. Ross answered Knob's message, saying, "I'm open to the idea. What did you have in mind?" Knob told him that in order to make an official offer, he would need to see Silk Road's financials, which included sales, upgrade costs, salaries for administrators and monitors, and any other costs. With this information, Carl thought it would assist the investigation by giving law enforcement a clearer picture of just how big Silk Road was. But Ross didn't share those numbers. He was the only person with access to them. Not even Variety Jones knew the exact numbers, and he was his main advisor. Ross's answer instead was, "I think an offer for the entire operation would need to be 9 figures for me to consider it." The figure Ross was asking for wasn't far from $1 billion. Carl Force nearly fell off his chair. How many drugs were being distributed on this site, if that was the asking price? He composed himself and typed a response. "I could pay 9 figures, but I'm not sure Silk Road is worth that as of now." Instead, he offered what he called a spin-off. The idea was to create a market for the major dealers that would be called Masters of the Silk Road. In this market, the major dealers would get to sell in hundreds of kilos. Knob reminded the Dread Pirate Roberts that he knew a lot of smuggling routes all over the world, so he could help make it happen. He offered $2 million to have 20% ownership of the Masters of the Silk Road. The idea intrigued Ross, and he wanted to learn more. From then on, Knob and the Dread Pirate Roberts started to communicate regularly. Ross had no idea he was really speaking to a DEA agent, and Carl Force had no idea about the true identity of the Dread Pirate Roberts. But it was a promising start. To be continued. Our episodes deal with serious and often distressing incidents. If you feel at any time you need support, please contact your local crisis centre. For suggested phone numbers for confidential support, please see the show notes for this episode on your app. or on our website. When Ross Ulbricht, aka Dread Pirate Roberts, got the offer from a new user named Knob to start a new site called Masters of the Silk Road for major dealers, he was already having his own discussions with Variety Jones about different ways they could expand. Some ideas they had were Silk Digital, which would sell downloadable products like stolen software and hacking software. Silk Pharma was another idea, which would focus on prescription medication. And last but not least, the Armoury. Guns had created problems on Silk Road ever since they first appeared. A large part of the community weren't happy that guns were for sale. As detailed in the book Silk Road by Eileen Ormsby, one user stated, "While I support the right of someone being able to have a single shotgun for self-defence, I'm not comfortable with the idea of automatic and semi-automatic weapons being made available to anyone with the money to buy them. Just because we support the rights of people to put what they like in their own bodies doesn't mean that we are evil people, in spite of what the government would often have the general public believe." A poll was created titled, "Would you like to see the sale of guns removed from the Silk Road?" The vote was split at around 50-50. Many users started adopting a signature under their posts that read, "No guns on Silk Road." Even Tony76, the former respected seller who had played the Great 420 sales scam, stated that guns would be the downfall of Silk Road. He said it would bring unwanted attention from law enforcement. Author Nick Bilton outlines in the book American Kingpin that Variety Jones had tried to warn Ross that guns were not a good idea for business. At first, as was his nature, Variety Jones said it in a sarcastic and almost joking way. The way he put it was that it was better to remove the guns so Grandma can come here for her cheap Canadian farmer meds and not trip over a Glock 9mm. Then Variety Jones became more direct with Ross and told him guns would scare off a lot of clients. That's why they started discussing the possibility of opening up a separate site for guns, so that complaints from Silk Road users would stop. The first option they had in mind was to name the site Silk Armoury to continue on with the Silk brand, but Variety Jones said it didn't sound right, so they settled for the Armoury. Ross used code and programming from Silk Road to make the new website. He made a new logo, which was the letter A with wings. Once they launched the Armoury, they realised that the implications of having a website for weapons were a lot more complicated than having a website for drugs. With Silk Road, drugs could easily be shipped through the mail, and sellers constantly thought of new ways to stay ahead so the drugs wouldn't be detected. But shipping guns was a different matter altogether. It wasn't that easy to hide guns in the mail. Ross considered this and posted on his Facebook wall asking if anyone knew someone who worked in the shipping sector. One of his friends on Facebook asked why, and Ross answered that he had a new startup idea. Ross and Variety Jones knew they were a target for law enforcement, but the reality was, they had no idea if they were on anyone's radar or not at that point. Just to be safe, Variety Jones decided he would head to Thailand, where he said he had hidden before and where he had dirty cops working for him. Ross decided to leave Austin too. He moved to San Francisco. He had been contemplating a move for a while, and coincidentally, a friend of his, Renee, asked him to move to San Francisco with him. Renee said they could work on building a startup business together, and Ross could stay in the apartment with he and his girlfriend. Ross accepted. But before leaving, he had to have another discussion with his ex-girlfriend, Julia. Ross had told his old programming friend, Richard, that he sold Silk Road and no longer had anything to do with it, but he hadn't had that discussion with Julia yet. So Ross messaged Julia through Facebook and arranged a meeting. Ross asked her if she'd told anyone else about the site apart from Erica. Julia apologised again for ever telling Erica to begin with and assured him that she hadn't told anyone else. Then, Ross told her that he had given Silk Road away. It had caused him too much stress, and the only reason he'd kept it for so long was because he liked the power that came with it. But now, he was finished. Someone else was running it. Julia believed his lie and thanked him for giving it up. Ross said they probably wouldn't be seeing each other again for a long time because he was leaving town. And that was that. In the summer of 2012, Ross left for San Francisco. Almost as soon as Ross arrived in San Francisco, he had an altercation with Variety Jones. It wasn't their first altercation either. They previously had a disagreement over the Great 420 sale and giveaway. The person who won the prize had bought a lot of heroin and practically overdosed on it. Variety Jones didn't think it was a good idea giving him the money for the prize as he was trying to get clean. But Ross laughed it off and said they should give away a prize to rehab for the next contest. They also had a disagreement over the selling of heroin itself. Variety Jones hated heroin and he didn't want to profit off of it. But Ross saw things differently, believing it wasn't up to him to stop someone from doing what they wanted to do. But their latest argument was a more significant one. Variety Jones wanted co-ownership of Silk Road. He said they could do things one of two ways. Either they went 50-50, or Variety Jones would take Silk Road for himself. Ross couldn't believe what he was hearing. He told Variety Jones to bring it on if he wanted, because he wasn't going to give in to his demands. Variety Jones was already making $60,000 a month for his services, and that's where Ross was leaving it. He wasn't giving away equity. After some heated discussion, Variety Jones accepted Ross's decision and didn't try and make a play to take over Silk Road. Their discussions then moved on to another topic: security. They were both well aware the authorities might be watching their every move. At that point in time, they hadn't come face to face with anyone suspicious, but they wanted to be ready in case they ever did. Already, some months prior, Ross implemented secret questions with each of his employees. Ross gave each employee a question and a specific answer to that question. The only people who knew the question and the answer were Ross and his employee. If Ross got the wrong answer to his question, he would immediately shut down the account of the employee. Ross then adopted another condition for his employees. If someone wanted to work for him, he or she would have to provide some sort of ID. This could be a driver's license or a passport. It wasn't just about wanting to know who worked for him, it was also a guarantee for himself. His employees were starting to handle more and more responsibilities, and some even had access to Bitcoin accounts. So now, if someone decided to steal from him, he would have their name and address. He made it clear to his employees that was the purpose of providing the ID, and that he wasn't someone to mess with. Along with these new employment conditions, Ross took care of security on his laptop. Earlier that year, he'd bought a Samsung laptop. The problem was, he hadn't encrypted it at all. Variety Jones had recently discussed a case on the news. A man who was leaking information to WikiLeaks had been arrested, and his computer was very easily accessed by the FBI because he used the same password to log into his computer, and for the encryption. Ross and Variety Jones both agreed this was very stupid. If he had used different passwords that were both strong, the FBI might not have been able to get into his computer so easily, if at all. Ross was adamant that he wouldn't make the same mistake. Variety Jones told him to set his laptop to do two things. One was to shut down automatically if it hadn't been used for a certain amount of time, and second was to install a kill switch. A kill switch automatically shuts down the computer with the press of a predetermined key on the keyboard. Variety Jones explained that this was essential because if the FBI came after him and approached him in public, catching him off guard, he would just need to press one key on his laptop and it would shut down. And if he did his encryption right, the FBI would never be able to access his computer because they wouldn't have his passwords. Therefore, they would have no proof against Ross. Ross did as Variety Jones told him and made those two changes on his laptop. Ross asked if he should store all of the Silk Road files on the cloud. That way, they wouldn't be on his computer at all. But that would make working on the site a lot slower, so Variety Jones instructed Ross to keep the files on his computer, but to make sure he encrypted every single one of them. After this encryption process, Ross made another change to his computer. He partitioned the hard drive. This meant that his computer was separated into two parts. One part would be for Ross and his personal life, and the other part would be for the Dread Pirate Roberts and Silk Road. From that moment on, Ross completely respected the different sides. He never did anything related to his personal life on the Dread Pirate Roberts side, and he never did anything related to Dread Pirate Roberts or Silk Road on his personal side. Lastly, Ross wrote down a list on his computer called Emergency. It was a to-do list in case he ever felt he was in real danger of being caught. The items he wrote on the list were: encrypt and back up important files on laptop to memory stick, destroy laptop's hard drive and hide dispose, destroy phone and hide dispose, find place to live on Craigslist for cash and create new identity, name and backstory. All of these steps were taken while Variety Jones went to mingle once again with the dealers and buyers on Silk Road. But this time, he wasn't getting a gauge for dissent and mutiny. He was mingling to see if any law enforcement representatives were lurking on the site. In the meantime, by October 2012, 1 year after he'd started his investigation, Jared Duryagian from Chicago Homeland Security Investigations team had gotten quite far. He was working in what was essentially a team of one. A few others knew what he was doing and helped him here and there, but mostly, Jared did it all by himself. He had now seized over 2,000 envelopes containing drugs. They were neatly classified in his office, and with his profiling system, he managed to identify and link certain drugs to sellers on Silk Road. He was able to make several arrests by doing this. Once he had the sellers in custody, he made them hand in their Silk Road accounts, and Jared took them over. He then entered the site and pretended to be them. Jared never planned on making sales of his own, and unlike Carl Force from the Baltimore DEA office, he never tried to contact the Dread Pirate Roberts. He didn't believe that would work. What he was interested in was building his Silk Road profile further and understanding more about the site. What Jared believed would work, and what he had been trying to do from the beginning, was to try and get in the shoes of the people who were using Silk Road. To try and think like they did. And this is exactly what he did when trying to figure out who the Dread Pirate Roberts was. Since the seller accounts had shown him more about the community, but not much more about the Dread Pirate Roberts, Jared went to the best source available: the Dread Pirate Roberts forum posts. The Dread Pirate Roberts had posted many messages, and those messages had evolved over time. At the beginning, when he was the Silk Road administrator, the messages were simpler or stuck mostly to whatever announcement he had to make about the site. But as time passed, and when he changed his name from admin to the Dread Pirate Roberts, the messages got longer and had more of a revolutionary idea behind them. The Dread Pirate Roberts spoke more and more about the poor role of the government and how Silk Road would never fall into the hands of it. Jared knew the Dread Pirate Roberts was a well-read individual. He even managed a book club in the Silk Road forums. He selected a book each week that the Silk Road community could then discuss. Knowledge was power, and reading was one of the best ways to increase your knowledge, the Dread Pirate Roberts said. The books focused on agorism, counter-economics, anarcho-capitalism, Austrian economics, political philosophy, freedom issues, and related topics. As a way to try and understand how the Dread Pirate Roberts thought, Jared read the books. However, he found them very dense, and he didn't agree with libertarianism. To him, it felt like a set of beliefs put together designed for the sole purpose of not having to take responsibility for your actions. But the books did help him to continue building a profile on who the Dread Pirate Roberts could be. So far, Jared's theory was that the Dread Pirate Roberts was very educated. He didn't seem rich, but he didn't seem poor either, so most likely he belonged to the middle class. And although he was completely against the government and spoke about a revolution, money and profit was definitely a motivation. One more important conclusion Jared had was that the Dread Pirate Roberts was young. Jared concluded this based on the wording in his forum posts. The words he used and the way he spelt them, it looked to Jared like someone young was behind them. While Jared was analysing the Dread Pirate Roberts forum posts, he was informed that an agent from the DEA who was working with a Homeland Security team in Baltimore was chatting with the Dread Pirate Roberts regularly. This was of course Agent Carl Force, who was posing as Nob on Silk Road. Jared was initially frustrated about this fact, but then he saw the positive side of it. It would give him further conversations to analyse. Jared asked for the chat logs between Nob and the Dread Pirate Roberts, but when he got the logs, he felt alarmed by what he was reading. He noticed immediately that Agent Carl Force, in his Nob persona, was trying to play friends with the Dread Pirate Roberts. He was trying to gain his trust, but by doing so, he was giving away too much information. Carl had gone as far as telling the Dread Pirate Roberts that he should have alternate passports made with a new identity, and he should look for a new place to live that was far from US laws and regulations. Jared was right to be alarmed, because Ross was taking Nob's advice and doing exactly that. In November 2012, Ross flew to Dominica, an island in the Caribbean. Ross had done his research and found that it was one of the best places he could escape to. There were two main reasons. The first was that in Dominica, you could buy citizenship with an investment of $75,000. And the second was that it was a tax-free country. One of the main worries Ross had was that by exchanging his bitcoins for cash, he would draw suspicion. His account was getting larger and larger, and the value of Bitcoin itself was growing as well. As good as that was from a financial perspective, it also posed a problem. Ross had no idea how to remove money from his Bitcoin account without getting asked the question, where did all that money come from? But in Dominica, he didn't need to justify his income to the government, so Ross travelled there to have his citizenship expedited. While he was travelling, Silk Road suffered from another hacking attack. When Ross got to Dominica, he had no option but to do what the hackers asked, to hand over $10,000 worth of Bitcoin. After Ross gave them the 10 grand, the hackers realised they could ask for more. So before stopping the attacks, they demanded a further $15,000. Again, Ross found himself with no other option. He had to pay up. Once the hacking attacks were over, he continued with his plans in Dominica. One of the conditions in order to get citizenship was presenting recommendation letters from people who had known him for a long time. So Ross asked some of his friends. They knew he was constantly searching for startup opportunities, and when he explained the tax-free opportunities in Dominica, it made sense to them. They weren't suspicious at all. While Ross took care of the paperwork, he also searched for other alternative places to escape, just in case. Variety Jones had told him not to settle for one, but to search for 2 or more places to escape to. Ross was interested in Costa Rica, Thailand, where Variety Jones was, and a few places in Europe. But he didn't like the idea of having to hide, possibly for years. And he also didn't like not being able to talk about Silk Road or its problems to anyone in real life. From the book American Kingpin, Ross told Variety Jones, "The worst part is that I have no one to talk to about this stuff with. It just bounces around in my head." Variety Jones answered, "Best advice I can give right now is plan on a few years without emotional attachments. Exes can put you in jail for life." The one thing Ross took solace in was a new feature he introduced to Silk Road, Silk Road's movie night. He set a date for everyone in the community who wanted to take part. They all downloaded the same movie and watched it at the same time. The movie he chose was V for Vendetta, one of his favourites. He saw a lot of similarities between the movie and Silk Road, and he posted the following quote from it. "People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people." When Ross finished completing the paperwork in Dominica and he was sure that his citizenship application was in process, he returned to San Francisco. Upon his return, he found himself with many more problems. The hacking attack that occurred when he was flying to Dominica had forced his programmer to shut Silk Road down for 2 days. During those 2 days, buyers and sellers became increasingly worried that Silk Road wouldn't return at all. Many wondered if the Dread Pirate Roberts had left with all of their money. Their fears were alleviated once Silk Road went back online. But that wasn't the end of it. Many theorised that the Dread Pirate Roberts wasn't the same Dread Pirate Roberts anymore. Sometime prior, as part of local security measures and contingencies, the Dread Pirate Roberts announced that he would try and change his writing style in his posts so that it would become more undetectable. But this backfired, as many suspected it wasn't the same Dread Pirate Roberts anymore. They thought it was someone else completely. Silk Road's movie night became criticised too. Many believed that the true Dread Pirate Roberts would never post a link to a torrent site to download a movie because it would go against the very strict security measures he was claiming to keep. Other scams continued to take place as well. One which many users fell for was the hidden Wikipedia scam. Someone had changed the link to Silk Road on the hidden Wikipedia page and replaced it for a link to a clone of the Silk Road page. The clone site looked exactly like the real thing. The difference was that the clone site asked you to enter your PIN code for your Bitcoin wallet to log in. So when a person entered their PIN code on the clone site, they soon had their Bitcoin stolen. Another scam came in December 2012. Someone changed some of the images on the seller's accounts and added a quick buy button. The quick buy button redirected the person to a Bitcoin address where they had to send their money to make the quick buy. But it was a complete scam. These scams brought endless complaints, but by the end of December 2012, Ross was able to get things back to normal and focus on what was important: expanding. The armory proved to be a bad decision. There wasn't a single sale of a gun, so he closed it down. He temporarily allowed for guns to be sold on Silk Road again, but due to backlash, he removed them and said they wouldn't be returning to Silk Road. Around this time, other new listings started to appear, as detailed in the book American Kingpin. One of Ross's employees sent him the following message. So we have a vendor selling cyanide. Not sure where we stand on this. He's not listing it as a poison, but it's only the most well-known assassination and suicide poison out there. LOL. Ross requested a link to the listing. The seller had written that cyanide was perfect for cleaning gold and silver, and could even be used to treat leprosy. And with every sale of cyanide, he would throw in a free copy of an ebook called The Final Exit, a guide to suicide. Ross decided to allow this listing. Soon after, one of his employees sent him this message. Question for you. Do we allow selling kidneys and livers? The seller said in the listing that the entire operation would be consensual. Ross replied, yes, if the source consents, then it's okay. Morals are easy when you understand the non-aggression principle. One of the first things a person read when they entered Silk Road was the following message. You may be shocked to find listings here that are outlawed in your jurisdiction. That doesn't mean Silk Road is lawless. In fact, we have a very strict code of conduct that, if given a chance, most people I think would agree with. Our basic rules are to treat others as you would wish to be treated, mind your own business, and don't do anything to hurt or scam someone else. In the spirit of those rules, there are some things you will never see here, and if you do, please report them. They include child pornography, stolen goods, assassinations, and stolen personal information, just to name a few. So Ross wasn't against the selling of organs or body parts. In fact, he thought if other sellers followed through, it might be a good way of expanding the business. Body parts and organs went for a much higher price than drugs. A kidney alone could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But Ross's main goal for expansion was implementing the Masters of the Silk Road idea that had been proposed by Nob, the offshoot site from Silk Road that would focus on bulk drug sales. He had been going back and forth discussing the idea with Nob over the last few months, and it was finally about to happen. Nob wanted to do a test buy, and Ross found a buyer for 1 kilo of cocaine. The delivery of coke was arranged for January 2013. Ross waited anxiously to see if the delivery was a success. But Nob had other plans. The Baltimore Homeland Security Investigations Team had formed a task force called the Marco Polo Task Force, and their biggest asset was DEA agent Carl Force, who was posing as Nob on Silk Road. Carl was once again acting without authorisation in relation to his Masters of the Silk Road idea. He was continuing to play by his own rules. His conversations with the Dread Pirate Roberts took place on TorChat, and they were recorded and monitored by the Marco Polo Task Force. Although they didn't approve of his idea to set up the Masters of the Silk Road site, there wasn't much they could do about it. The plan was already in action. Carl said he was just playing the friend card with the Dread Pirate Roberts, but Jared from the Homeland Security Office in Chicago wasn't the only one who was questioning what information Carl was giving away. They talked about nearly everything, including sometimes personal experiences. But it was the information about drug smuggling that Carl was giving to the Dread Pirate Roberts that most concerned the Baltimore Task Force. For example, Carl explained how to avoid the mail system completely with large quantities of drugs by doing dead drops. Dead drops involve a dealer leaving drugs at a location, like a hired locker. Then the dealer would provide the combination code to the buyer. The buyer would take the drugs and leave the money inside the locker. That way, both dealer and buyer could make the transaction without ever needing to meet face to face. Carl was also telling the Dread Pirate Roberts that he loved him, to stay safe, and he even wished him good night. When Carl's supervisor questioned these conversations, Carl simply answered that he needed to gain the Dread Pirate Roberts' trust, and he was saying whatever it took to do that. Homeland Security and the DEA weren't the only agencies involved in the Marco Polo Task Force in Baltimore. It also included people from the Postal Service who helped track the drugs in the mail, and agents from the Secret Service to try and follow the money on Silk Road. Sean Bridges was a Secret Service agent working on the task force, and he desperately wanted to be the one to bring down the Dread Pirate Roberts, as did Carl Force. There was a lot of competition between the competing agencies. There was even competition between agents within the same agency. Everyone wanted to be the one to crack the case. It would be a career maker. This resulted in poor communication and exchange of information. But Sean Bridges and Carl Force decided to team up. They came up with a plan to involve the NSA in the Silk Road case. They had heard that the NSA could get into any computer in the world, so they wanted their help. Sean Bridges had a contact in the NSA, and he managed to arrange a meeting with an analyst from the agency. Sean and Carl met up with the analyst, but didn't tell anyone else in the Marco Polo Task Force. The analyst explained to them that the NSA couldn't touch a case unless it was a threat to national security. So Carl and Sean came up with a new plan. They would buy explosives from Silk Road, which were for sale at the time, and that way they could prove that Silk Road was a threat to national security. Their idea was to buy pipe bombs and have them delivered to a secret government post office box. But they aborted their plan when they realised that having bombs delivered in the mail could be dangerous and problematic for them. So that's when Carl Force decided to move forward with his Masters of the Silk Road idea, and he asked the Dread Pirate Roberts to find a buyer for 1 kilo of cocaine. The price was $27,000. Ross asked one of his employees, who went by the username Chronic Pain, to find a buyer. Chronic Pain's real name was Curtis Green. Curtis found a buyer, and the plan was for the kilo of coke to be delivered to Curtis's house first. The Dread Pirate Roberts sent Nob the address. As soon as Carl got the address, the entire Marco Polo task force started moving. The delivery was set to take place on a Wednesday in January 2013. The entire Baltimore task force travelled 2,000 miles to Curtis's address in Spanish Fork, Utah. Carl had a contact in law enforcement there, and he asked to borrow 1 kilo of cocaine from their evidence room. Carl got the kilo, then arranged a priority mail package at the local post office. The plan was to do a controlled delivery. An officer would pose as a mailman. They parked the van outside Curtis's house. The rest of the task force, including a SWAT team, were parked around the block. The delivery was made at 11 a.m. Carl sat in a car across the street, watching the entire operation unfold. The officer posing as the mailman grabbed the package from the back of the van and left it at Curtis Green's front door. He then returned to the van and waited. A few minutes passed before the door of the house opened and Curtis Green looked out from the doorway. He was in his 40s and used a crane to get around. He stared at his surroundings and saw the white mail van still parked out the front. Then he stared at the package waiting for him on the porch. He slowly walked towards the package, picked it up, walked towards the garbage can next to his house, and threw it out. Then he returned inside and closed the door. Carl watched Curtis's every move and he didn't understand what was happening. He started communicating with the rest of the task force and they tried to work out their next move. If Curtis didn't take the package, there wasn't much they could do. But before they could make a decision, Curtis Green opened the front door again. He walked back to the trash can, grabbed the package, and entered his house with it, closing the door behind him. As soon as he closed the door, the task force made their move. The SWAT team went in first. They broke in the front door and yelled at Curtis Green to get on the ground. Curtis was taken by surprise. He had a pair of scissors in one hand, the package was open on the table, and part of his face was covered in cocaine. He immediately did as he was told and dropped to the floor. The officers then started searching Curtis's house. Curtis was wearing a money belt attached to his hip, and it had $23,000 cash inside. In Curtis's basement, they found several computers that were all linked together. They knew Curtis worked as a moderator for the Dread Pirate Roberts, but they soon discovered he had other responsibilities as well. Firstly, his computers worked to mine Bitcoin. The process is complex, but in simple terms, all of the transactions made with Bitcoin need to be verified by multiple sources. This verification process is called mining and is performed by a distributed network of computers. Anyone can run mining software, and as a reward for doing so, they receive small amounts of Bitcoin. When Curtis was caught, mining could still be done on computers at home, or with several computers. But today, mining Bitcoins is a very expensive investment because the algorithms become more and more complex and it takes expensive computer equipment to solve them. Apart from the mining of Bitcoins, the agents found out something else. Curtis Green handled logins and passwords of Silk Road users, and he also handled the Bitcoins that were in Silk Road's escrow account. Secret Service agent Sean Bridges was especially interested in this, as his role was to follow the money. While he got what evidence he could from the computers down in the basement, Carl Force started talking to Curtis. Curtis explained that the Dread Pirate Roberts had authorised him to control the Bitcoins. When a user paid for a product, the site guarded the money until the buyer was satisfied, and Curtis had access to all of that money. Curtis was arrested, taken to the local police station, booked, processed, and then released. He stayed hidden in his house in fear, certain that the Dread Pirate Roberts would realise that he wasn't on the site working like he ought to be. And soon enough, the Dread Pirate Roberts did realise. When Curtis Green, or Chronic Pain as he was known on Silk Road, didn't log in the following day, Ross grew suspicious that something might have happened, since Curtis was the one receiving the kilo of cocaine. With Ross's new safety measures he had put in place for his employees, he had Curtis's identification, so he did a Google search of his name. That led him to a website that showed recent arrests, and there, he saw Curtis Green's mugshot. But that wasn't the only thing that Ross found out. A few days later, he discovered that there was $350,000 missing from user accounts, and there wasn't much doubt as to who was responsible. Curtis Green was the only person who had access to that money. Initially, Ross didn't know what to do, but the more he thought about it, the more he felt that Curtis Green had to pay. Ross wanted the money back, and Curtis had to learn a lesson. Ross consulted Variety Jones, and Variety Jones not only believed that Curtis deserved to get roughed up, but he gave the Dread Pirate Roberts a contact he had. It was a man from Ireland that went by the name Irish. He would travel to wherever he had to and make someone disappear if needed. The problem was that Irish didn't know anything about technology or computers, so he wouldn't be able to use Curtis's computers to return the stolen bitcoins. Ross consulted another of his most trusted employees, Inigo. Inigo offered to go to Utah himself and pay Curtis Green a visit, but Inigo was the employee with most responsibilities on Silk Road, so Ross didn't want to risk having him away from the computer. Ross came up with another idea. A week after Curtis's arrest, DEA agent Carl Force arranged a meeting with him in a hotel room in Salt Lake City, Utah. While posing as Knob on Silk Road, Carl had found out that the Dread Pirate Roberts knew of Curtis's arrest, so Carl arranged a meeting with Curtis. He took Secret Service agent Sean Bridges and a postal worker with him. Curtis showed up with his lawyer. They all sat down and Curtis immediately began rambling, telling the agents that he was a good Mormon boy who hadn't committed any crimes before and he'd just made a mistake. At one point in the conversation, his lawyer interrupted him and recommended that he confess everything he knew to the agents. The lawyer then left the meeting, leaving Curtis alone. Curtis continued rambling, but he didn't share any information that the agents weren't already aware of. At lunchtime, they took a break, hoping that Curtis would provide something useful after they ate. During the lunch break, Carl took out his laptop and logged into Silk Road. He wanted to speak to the Dread Pirate Roberts and see if he could find anything out about Curtis that he could use against him during the questioning. Carl was successful in chatting to the Dread Pirate Roberts during the lunch break, and they did speak about Curtis. But the conversation was nothing like Carl had expected. The Dread Pirate Roberts shared with Knob that he was pissed off to no end because one of his employees had stolen bitcoins from him. Knob replied, "Who is it and where is he?" Carl was shocked when the Dread Pirate Roberts sent him Curtis Green's ID photo. In fact, Carl looked straight at Curtis and said, "You stole money from the Dread Pirate Roberts." Curtis didn't seem to understand what was happening, and he answered, "No, you've got to be kidding me. I wouldn't even know how to steal a penny from him." The Dread Pirate Roberts continued talking to Knob and asked him if he knew anyone who could beat Curtis Green up and force him to return the money. Knob told him he definitely knew people who could do that. The Dread Pirate Roberts asked how quickly Knob could take care of getting someone to Curtis's house. Knob replied that it shouldn't take too long at all. Carl closed his laptop and ordered the postal worker that was with him to fill the bathtub. He then explained to Curtis what was going to happen. They would pretend to torture him, but it would have to look real. They would drown him in the bathtub and Carl would videotape it to have proof for the Dread Pirate Roberts. Carl knew it wasn't an attractive option for Curtis, but as he explained, it was either fake his torture or risk the Dread Pirate Roberts sending someone else to do it for real. Curtis was terrified of the Dread Pirate Roberts and he agreed to the fake torture. The postal worker pretended to be the torturer and Carl filmed it. The postal worker sunk Curtis's head into the bathtub over and over again. Carl was encouraging the torture in the background. But the Dread Pirate Roberts was having a change of heart. He had been conflicted on the best course of action to take ever since the bitcoins were stolen, and now the torture of Curtis was actually taking place. He was questioning himself if it was the right thing to do. He raised his concerns with Variety Jones, who told him, "At what point in time do we decide we've had enough of someone's shit and terminate them?" That was the very option that Dread Pirate Roberts had been considering, and it was good to hear that Variety Jones was thinking the same way. Dread Pirate Roberts passed the message on to Nob, and Nob agreed to kill Curtis Green. The price they agreed on was $80,000, $40,000 up front and $40,000 after the job was completed. A week later, Nob sent the Dread Pirate Roberts a message. Their conversation is outlined in the book American Kingpin. Nob said, "Green is dead and disposed of. I'll get you a picture for proof of death." The Dread Pirate Roberts answered, "Okay, thank you. I guess they were unable to get him to send the coins he stole." Nob: "They had to do CPR on him one time. Actually, the trick to torturing someone is keeping the guy alive. Died of asphyxiation/heart rupture." After that message, Nob didn't get a reply back from the Dread Pirate Roberts, so he sent him another message. "You okay?" Dread Pirate Roberts responded, "A little disturbed, but I'm okay. I'm new to this kind of thing is all." That same day, Variety Jones tried to calm Dread Pirate Roberts by telling him, "We're playing for keeps. I'm perfectly comfortable with the decision, and I'll sleep like a lamb tonight, and every other night hereafter." Dread Pirate Roberts soon received an email from Nob with a picture that showed Curtis Green's body. Ross looked at it for a few moments, saved the picture to an encrypted folder on his computer, and paid Nob the final $40,000. Ross believed that was the end of it. Curtis Green was dead. Except he wasn't. Just like the torture had been faked, the murder had been faked as well. When Carl found out that the Dread Pirate Roberts had escalated to murder, he was already back in Baltimore, so he gave Curtis Green a call and told him how to fake his own death. He wouldn't need much, Carl explained, just the Campbell soup can. He told Curtis to go to the bathroom, fill the bathtub with water and sink his head in it, then drink the Campbell soup and throw it up so it looked like blood had come out of his mouth. Finally, he would have to lie on the floor, look dead, and ask his wife to take a close-up picture of him with a cell phone, so the quality of the picture wouldn't be very good. And that was the picture that Ross received from Nob 1 week later. After the audit hit, things didn't get any easier on Silk Road. It seemed like every other day there was some new problem, a security breach, a scam, a hacking attack, or an extortion attempt. Like when the Dread Pirate Roberts received a message from a Silk Road user going by the nickname Friendly Chemist. Friendly Chemist told the Dread Pirate Roberts that he had hacked a known seller's account, and he had a long list of real names and real addresses, all belonging to members of Silk Road, and he was threatening to make the list public. Friendly Chemist sent a few of the names and addresses to the Dread Pirate Roberts so he knew the threat was real, and he also told him that the seller's account he hacked was Real Lucy Drops. He even gave the password to that account. The entire story involving Real Lucy Drop started with another user going by the name Lucy Drop. Lucy Drop was a seller with an excellent reputation, with a lot of sales and a lot of loyal customers. But just like Tony76 had done in the Great 420 sale and giveaway, Lucy Drop asked all buyers to finalise early, outside of Silk Road's escrow account. A lot of buyers agreed. They never got their drugs, and Lucy Drop walked away with about $100,000. Sometime later, a new user appeared on Silk Road with the name Real Lucy Drop. Real Lucy Drop claimed to be one of the people involved with the original Lucy Drop account, but he explained that his partner had fucked him over, stolen the computer, along with the names and addresses of the buyers, and then walked away with $100,000. Now, the person behind this new account named Friendly Chemist, who was extorting the Dread Pirate Roberts, apparently was the same person involved with the original Lucy Drop account that ripped off his partner and pulled off the $100,000 scam. As outlined in the book Silk Road, in exchange for not revealing any names or addresses, Friendly Chemist asked the Dread Pirate Roberts for $500,000, explaining that he owed that amount to his suppliers. The Dread Pirate Roberts' response was for Friendly Chemist to ask his suppliers to contact him directly to see if they could work something out. Soon after, the Dread Pirate Roberts was contacted by a new user going by the name Red and White. Red and White sent a message that read, "I was asked to contact you. We're the people Friendly Chemist owes money to. What do you want to talk to us about?" The Dread Pirate Roberts responded that he wasn't too sure how to sort this out, but he wanted to come to a conclusion that would benefit everyone. So if Red and White was having problems with a bad distributor, referring to Friendly Chemist, then they should start distributing themselves on Silk Road. Red and White replied they'd be more than happy to join Silk Road once they got the money that was owed to them. The conversation between the two of them went back and forth for a few days until the Dread Pirate Roberts sent the following message. "Friendly Chemist is a liability, and I wouldn't mind if he was executed." Just after that message was sent, Friendly Chemist messaged the Dread Pirate Roberts and said he was giving him 72 hours before 5,000 user details and 24 seller identities were released. After getting this message, the Dread Pirate Roberts changed his tune with Red and White. He went from "wouldn't mind if Friendly Chemist was executed" to something more certain. He said, "I would like to put a bounty on his head if it's not too much trouble for you. What would be an adequate amount to motivate you to find him? Necessities like this do happen from time to time for a person in my position." The adequate amount for Red and White ranged from $150,000 to $300,000, depending on the type of hit. Since Dread Pirate Roberts had just paid $80,000 for the murder of Curtis Green, he thought the price was a bit high, and he asked Red and White if that was the best he could do. Red and White said it was, because given the time frame Friendly Chemist had set, there wasn't much time before all those names got released. They agreed on a $150,000 fee. They settled on photographic proof, just like Ross had done with Curtis Green. But the problem in this case was that Ross didn't know who Friendly Chemist was in real life or what they looked like. So he gave Red and White some numbers to be written down on a piece of paper and placed next to the body. The following day, Red and White reported back, "Your problem has been taken care of. Rest easy, because he won't be blackmailing anyone again. Ever." But that wasn't the end of it. A few days later, Red and White messaged the Dread Pirate Roberts again to let him know some new information. When the men killed Friendly Chemist, they questioned him, and he confessed that he was working with a partner in the blackmail, and that partner was Tony76. Tony76, the seller who pulled the great 420 sale and giveaway scam on Silk Road users, walking away with about $250,000, the biggest scam ever pulled on Silk Road. Red and White added that Friendly Chemist had given up the real name of Tony76. Dread Pirate Roberts responded, "I would like to go after Tony76. If he's our man, then he likely has substantial assets to be recovered. Perhaps we can hold him and question him." Red and White explained there was a problem. Tony76 lived with 3 of his drug dealing partners, and they were usually at home. Dread Pirate Roberts answered that he just wanted Tony76 to be hit, but Red and White offered to kill Tony76 and his 3 partners for $500,000. Red and White also explained that there would be more chances of getting back the stolen money, and perhaps more that they didn't even know about if all of them were killed. Ross thought about it, and at the end of the day he came to a decision. He gave the go-ahead. 1 week later, Red and White told the Dread Pirate Roberts that the problem had been dealt with, and he had one less thing to worry about. Ross had now paid for 6 murders in total. Around this same time, the FBI's Cybercrime Division got involved in the Silk Road investigation. FBI agent Chris Tarbell had actually been considering going after Silk Road for several months, but he wasn't quite sure what the best strategy would be, and he was still debating that when he received a visit from a DEA agent in the beginning of 2013. The DEA agent was from a team in New York. The New York team was conducting their own investigation, separate to the Chicago and Baltimore-based teams. The agent explained that right after the Gawker article came out, Senator Schumer had given a very public announcement where he called on the DEA to shut Silk Road down. But there was a problem. The DEA knew how to run drug investigations, but they didn't know how to deal with computers and the deep web. Which was why 18 months had passed since Senator Schumer's announcement, and the New York DEA team was still unsure how to go about the case. So they finally made the decision to approach the FBI's Cybercrime Division for help. Tarbell and his cybercrime team listened to everything the agent had to say, and then they made their decision. They weren't going to assist the DEA with Silk Road. They were going to go after Silk Road themselves. On the face of it, the FBI's Cybercrime Division had the exact opposite problem to the DEA. They were fine with the technology side of things, but they didn't have experience in drug investigations. However, the New York DEA agent had mentioned something that got their attention. The leader of Silk Road, the Dread Pirate Roberts, was becoming more brazen in what was for sale. Before, it was mainly drugs, but after that came firearms, explosives, and now, hacking tools. The FBI's cybercrime team immediately checked what hacking tools were for sale. They found listings for keyloggers, banking trojans, malware applications, spyware applications, and much more. They knew that's how they would get inside the case. Tarbell called the higher-ups of the agency, presented his idea, and weeks later, he was given approval to open a case on Silk Road. The cybercrime team started analysing Silk Road in detail, and they came to a conclusion. Their chances of catching the Dread Pirate Roberts and shutting down the site depended entirely on human error. The technology Silk Road used was strong. Both Tor and Bitcoin were built to help keep anonymity, and that was what made the case such a painstaking ordeal to anyone who crossed paths with it. But they also knew that Tor, Bitcoin, and Silk Road were built and used by humans, and humans made mistakes. So that's what the FBI Cybercrime Division waited for. A mistake. And it came. Ross had been dealing with security problems on Silk Road ever since it started, and in May 2013, he had a major one. There was a coding error that made the IP address of the server go public. Ross immediately fixed the mistake, and soon enough everything went back to normal. The IP address of the server was no longer showing. But Ross was worried that if anyone was watching at that precise moment, they might have noticed it. And he was right to be worried. The FBI cybercrime team were watching. Even though Silk Road was in the deep web, it was still housed by a server, and the code of that server had just been revealed. Chris Tarbell got to work locating it, and he found it a few hours later. It was in Iceland. If this server was the real Silk Road server and it hadn't been encrypted or erased, they could have all the information they needed on Silk Road. Tarbell took that chance and travelled to Iceland. He talked to the local authorities and they said they would allow him access to the server. It was agreed that they would send Tarbell a thumb drive containing all of the information on the Silk Road server. Tarbell received this in June 2013. He immediately showed the thumb drive to his computer scientist, Thomas Kiernan. Kiernan entered the thumb drive into his computer, and after a few seconds, they were looking at all of the folders that housed Silk Road. But they were all encrypted. Tarbell couldn't believe it. If the folders were encrypted, they would never be able to access them. Like Variety Jones had said when he first told Ross to encrypt everything, if you have good encryption and a strong password, the FBI could never find you. Kiernan tried every trick he knew to beat the encryption, but nothing worked. it looked like that was going to be the end of the server lead. Until a few days later. Tarbell was talking on the phone with Assistant US Attorney Seren Turner from New York. Turner was aware of the server lead and Tarbell's trip to Iceland, and he asked him if there had been any advances in the investigation. Tarbell said there hadn't been because they couldn't get past the encryption, and Turner was confused. He asked why the passcode hadn't worked. It was Tarbell's turn to be confused. What passcode? Turner explained that the authorities in Iceland had sent him a passcode for the encrypted files. For some reason, it wasn't passed on to Tarbell when he got the thumb drive. But now he had it. The passcode was, "Try to crack this, NSA." All one word. Tarbell quickly ended the call and went to see his computer scientist. He gave him the passcode. And it worked. They were inside the encrypted files of Silk Road. On July 13, 2013, a deconfliction meeting was arranged by the Department of Justice. It had come to their attention that there were too many different agencies going after Silk Road, and none of them were cooperating with each other. There was Jared Duryagian from Homeland Security in Chicago. There was the Marco Polo Task Force made up of agents from Homeland Security in Baltimore, Carl Force from the DEA, Sean Bridges from the Secret Service, as well as people from the Postal Service. There was the DEA in New York who were trying to make something happen. And now, there was the FBI's Cybercrime Division. Another agency was also represented at this deconfliction meeting. Gary Alford, who worked for the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. When the New York DEA requested the help of the FBI Cybercrime Division, they also requested help from the IRS. Gary Alford got involved in the investigation and moved officers to join the New York DEA task force. Gary's job was to follow the money. When Gary was added to the task force, he had never heard of Silk Road, but as soon as he started reading up on it, he became hooked. Like most of the people working on the case, Gary wanted to be the one to find out who the Dread Pirate Roberts was. He even had a theory about how he was going to do it, as detailed in the book American Kingpin. Gary was born in the summer of 1977, when a serial killer was terrorising the city, a man nicknamed the Son of Sam. A huge investigation was launched to try and catch him, but there didn't seem to be any leads. That is, until an officer had the idea to go over all the parking tickets that were placed on cars near the murder scenes. He believed that the killer must have parked his car near the location of the murders, and during at least one of them would have forgotten to feed the parking meter and received a parking ticket as a result. The idea was considered unusual, but they went with it, and after going through thousands of parking tickets, they found a pattern. One man had gotten several tickets, and more than one linked him to the murder scenes. The officers paid him a visit, and he confessed to being the Son of Sam. Gary Alford believed that's the way they would catch the Dread Pirate Roberts, only instead of parking tickets, it would be through a trace he had left of himself online. Working with this theory, Gary followed everything the Dread Pirate Roberts had done, and like Chicago-based Homeland Security agent Jared Duryagian had done before him, he studied the Dread Pirate Roberts' posts on Silk Road. Gary started to build a profile, and he concluded that the Dread Pirate Roberts was very educated when it came to the United States political system, so he was very likely from the US. Gary found that in the early posts from the Dread Pirate Roberts, he would talk about how Silk Road was much safer than buying drugs in the street, where those people could rip you off or beat you up. Gary found those lines curious. He also felt offended. He'd been born and raised in the housing projects in Brooklyn. He grew up with many of the people that the Dread Pirate Roberts described in his posts, the people from the street who would rip you off or beat you up. Gary didn't agree with those views, and it was for this reason he thought the Dread Pirate Roberts was most likely white and from the suburbs. Afterwards, he drew up a list of people he believed could possibly be the Dread Pirate Roberts. Among them, there was a man who was outspoken and managed a web forum, a man who worked with Bitcoin, and a programmer who had libertarian views. He then came up with another theory. Adrian Chen was the Dread Pirate Roberts. Adrian was the author of the Gawker article that had practically launched Silk Road. Gary thought that maybe Adrian was the Dread Pirate Roberts and he'd written a piece for self-promotion. It made sense, since most people had never heard of Silk Road before the article existed, and Gary thought that if Adrian Chen was indeed the Dread Pirate Roberts, then maybe he had written something about Silk Road before the article. Gary went to Google and searched for the Gawker article again. He read it over and over, trying to find anything unusual or something he had missed before. The thing that stood out was that Silk Road's website didn't end in .com, but in .onion. So he went to Google again and tried searching silkroad.onion, which he hadn't done before. He also filtered the results. He set it so that only results from before June 1st, 2011 would appear. That was the date the Gawker article was published. So if Adrian Chen had written anything about the site before then, the results would hopefully show it. Gary didn't get many results, but he did see something that he thought was interesting. A post on a forum called The Shroomery. Gary read the post that was from January 27, 2011. It was from someone who said that they'd casually come across a website called Silk Road, and they asked if anyone else had visited. Gary saw that the post was written by someone who called themselves Altoid, so he tried a new Google search. This time, he entered silkroad.onion Altoid, which led him to another post, this time on the Bitcoin Talk forum. In a thread about heroin, someone calling themselves Altoid was asking if anyone had heard of Silk Road. Gary couldn't get these posts from Altoid out of his mind. He contacted the managers of both forums and explained he was an agent from the government and he needed the name and email address that was linked to the Altoid accounts. At first, he was told that Altoid had only left behind a fake email, frosty@frosty.com. But Gary insisted, and further checks showed that Altoid had actually used another email address when first registering his accounts. But he soon deleted it, and then entered the Frosty address. Despite being deleted, the original email address used to create the Altoid accounts was still there. rossalbrecht@gmail.com. Gary searched for Ross Ulbricht on Google and found his LinkedIn account. Some things about Ross fit into his profile. Ross was white and from the suburbs, but he didn't have something that seemed vital for the Dread Pirate Roberts, a computer science background. Ross had been a physicist. Gary was far from convinced that Ross could be the Dread Pirate Roberts, but he still added him to his suspect list. So, at that deconfliction meeting held on July 13th between all of the different agencies investigating Silk Road, Gary Alford from the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS was excited to share what he had found. Luke Dembosky presided over the meeting. He was the highest-ranking official in the Department of Justice. Dembosky explained that the main point of the meeting was to be open about everything going on in everyone's different investigations, so that the Department of Justice could make a knowledgeable decision on who should lead the Silk Road case. The ones who started were the Marco Polo task force from Baltimore. Carl Forst decided not to attend the meeting, but those who did spoke of Carl's arrest of Curtis Green. They didn't mention the full details though. No mention that Carl was posing as Nob on Silk Road and actually talking to the Dread Pirate Roberts. They left that part out. But Dembosky was already aware of that detail, so he asked the Baltimore agents about their undercover account. They said they couldn't talk about it because it was before a grand jury and was classified. Dembosky was part of that grand jury. He was a major representative of the Department of Justice, the same department that made that information classified. He tried to get the Baltimore team to share what they had, but they weren't budging. Everyone wanted the glory. No one wanted to share information. Things got heated and a break was called to allow everyone to cool down. When the meeting resumed, Jared Duryagian decided to speak up. He was the Chicago-based Homeland Security agent who was basically running an investigation by himself. Before the meeting, the Baltimore Homeland Security agents warned Jared not to share any important information. They told him to stick to just the minimum because the FBI would be at the meeting and they would hear what he had to say, steal the info, pretend they came up with it, and take all the glory without giving Jared any credit. But Jared saw how that stance played out for the Baltimore team, so he decided to take a risk and share everything he had. Jared said that ever since October 2011, he had seized almost 3,500 packages. He explained how those packages helped him to make a profile by comparing the packaging and the drugs to the listings on Silk Road. This method had resulted in him identifying several Silk Road sellers, and he gave them the option to face the courts or to hand in their Silk Road account. They all took the option of handing in their Silk Road accounts. Jared then accessed the sellers' accounts and pretended to be them. Everyone present at the deconfliction meeting got a far greater understanding of how Silk Road worked thanks to Jared's presentation. They were actually dumbfounded. Jared had led an investigation in Chicago practically on his own and seemed to have gotten further than anyone else. That was until the FBI spoke. The FBI broke the news to everyone in the room. We have the server. But they explained they hadn't had a chance to properly go through it yet. They needed more time before they could share what they had. Dembosky said they could have more time, and then asked if anyone else in the room had anything to share. Gary Alford from the IRS didn't say a word. He had changed his mind. He didn't share anything he had found. He felt that everyone in the room seemed to be in competition with each other, and what he had really didn't amount to much compared to the others, so he kept it to himself. When the meeting came to an end, Dembosky announced that the Department of Justice would analyse everything and then make a decision on who would lead the case. Around the same time the FBI opened the encrypted files from the Silk Road server, Ross Ulbricht moved. Ross was talking to Nob, and Nob told him that he knew a corrupt agent involved in the Silk Road case that wouldn't mind giving away information, for a price. Ross had previously mentioned how useful it would be to have someone from law enforcement providing information to them, to help them stay ahead. Ross trusted Nob, as he still believed he was a smuggler who had made millions and who had managed to stay off law enforcement's radar for years. So he wasn't surprised when Nob told him about a corrupt investigator he knew. The investigator, who Nob called Kevin, wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in profit. So he would be perfect to help the Dread Pirate Roberts stay ahead. Nob told the Dread Pirate Roberts he could communicate with Kevin using PGP, an encrypted email and messaging service. Of course, there was no corrupt agent going by the name of Kevin. Carl had made him up. Carl was going to be the one selling the Dread Pirate Roberts information, and that's why he needed to move to an encrypted chat. He couldn't have anyone on the Baltimore task force seeing what he was up to. But the conversation he had just had wasn't on encrypted chat. So Carl deleted the chat history mentioning Kevin, and on the reports, he said there had been technical issues. Carl successfully erased all talk of Kevin and corrupt agents without anyone else from the task force noticing. Now, acting as Kevin, Carl wouldn't need to erase anything, because it was all on encrypted chat. The task force wouldn't be able to see Carl's conversations. Acting as corrupt agent Kevin, Carl explained to the Dread Pirate Roberts that he would give him information for a donation, which would cost $50,000 if the tip was good. What he told the Dread Pirate Roberts initially was that the FBI was now looking for him. Certain authorities had arrested Silk Road sellers and were accessing their accounts, and the FBI had Silk Road's files from the server. Learning this information wasn't the only reason that made Ross decide to move. There was a lot going on. He still wasn't sure how much Curtis Green had shared about Silk Road before his murder. He had just ordered the murders of 5 other men as well. Silk Road users Friendly Chemist, Tony76, and 3 of Tony's partners. Plus, hackers were still getting into Silk Road and stealing money from him. Now, with this new information Kevin had just given him, Ross thought it was time to make his emergency list a reality. Part of the list included destroying his laptop and phone, but Ross didn't believe matters had gotten that bad just yet. Destroying his laptop would mean destroying his access to Silk Road. He did believe matters had gotten bad enough to put the last lines of his emergency list into action though. Find place to live on Craigslist for cash and create new identity, name and a backstory. He found a room in a 3-bedroom house on Craigslist for $1,200. The place seemed perfect, since he would be subletting a room inside a house already owned by someone else, so there were no tracks leading to him, especially since he planned to pay in cash. As for his new identity, he created one that wasn't far removed from who he actually was. He introduced himself to the other occupants of the house as Joshua Terry. Joshua was 29 years old and was from Texas. He worked as a currency trader and did some freelance IT work on the side. He recently returned from a trip to Sydney and he liked to keep to himself. He spent most of his time working on his computer. He emphasised the fact that he did a lot of IT work and he spent a lot of time on his computer so that his new roommates wouldn't grow suspicious and start wondering what he was up to. Ross made his new identity close to his own, so he wouldn't forget any details. If he built a complicated persona, he ran the risk of tripping himself up. His new room was across town from where he was living in San Francisco with his friend Renee and Renee's girlfriend. It was far enough away that he wasn't worried about the people who knew him as Ross crossing paths with his new roommates who knew him as Joshua Terry. One of the first things Ross did when he moved was order a fake ID in the name of Joshua Terry. Fake IDs were of course available on Silk Road, so that's where he went. At this point, there were 1 million users on Silk Road, so you could find just about anything. Ross ordered the fake ID, except he didn't order just one. He ordered 9. On July 10, 2013, a Customs and Border Protection officer working at San Francisco International Airport was going through packages and envelopes, looking for anything out of the ordinary. He came face to face with a set of 3 envelopes that caught his attention. The 3 envelopes were from Canada, from 3 different addresses in Vancouver. There were 3 different senders listed on each envelope: Bert Harris, Cole Harris, and Arnold Harris. The 3 envelopes had the same shape, the same size, and the same handwriting. Sensing something was off, the customs officer completed a form that allowed him to open the envelopes, and when he did, he found 9 fake identity cards in the name of Joshua Terry. He emailed the Homeland Security Investigations Department in San Francisco, and an agent attended the airport to check it out. The Homeland Security agent saw the ID cards were addressed to the same person, and all 9 of them had the same picture. Only the picture had been slightly altered on each one, so the person looked slightly different. The agent visited the house where the fake IDs were headed, but when he arrived at 2260 15th Street, a man who didn't speak English opened the door, so the Homeland Security agent left with no answers. It was 2 weeks later, on July 26, 2013, that the agent realised he'd gone to the wrong address. He couldn't get the 9 fake ID cards out of his head, and he had another look at the envelopes. That's when he realised they were addressed to 15th Avenue, not 15th Street. By this time, he was busy with something else, so he sent 2 other San Francisco Homeland Security agents in his place. As the 2 agents walked towards the front door of 2260 15th Avenue, one of them pulled out the fake IDs to have another look before asking questions. When they reached the door, the same agent was about to knock, when he saw a man standing on the other side of the door wearing nothing but shorts. It was the man whose picture was on the fake identity cards. Ross Ulbricht froze. The two men in suits staring at him from outside the front door could only mean one thing. He managed to compose himself and slowly opened the door. To be continued. Our episodes deal with serious and often distressing incidents. If you feel at any time you need support, please contact your local crisis centre. For suggested phone numbers for confidential support, please see the show notes for this episode on your app or on our website. Ross Ulbricht had just put the last lines of his emergency list into action. Find place to live on Craigslist for cash and create new identity, name and backstory. He found a room to rent on Craigslist, paid cash, and said his name was Joshua Terry. He gave his new roommates a backstory for Joshua, one that was very similar to his own. He ordered fake IDs for his new identity from Silk Road, but those fake IDs were intercepted by Customs and Border Protection, and they had passed them on to the Homeland Security Office in San Francisco. Now, two agents from Homeland Security were knocking on Ross's door. Ross froze when he saw the agents. He thought it could only mean one thing, but he managed to compose himself and open the door. The agents asked him to step outside, and Ross complied. The agents showed him the fake IDs. Ross didn't utter a word, but he couldn't hide the fear on his face. He was shaking. This was it. His worst fears had come true. It was all over. They demanded to see his real ID. Ross handed it over and the agents did some checks. But nothing flagged. The agents could see how nervous he was and they told him to settle down. They weren't going to arrest him over a few fake IDs. They just wanted information. Where did he get the IDs from? Ross still wasn't sure what was happening. Were they trying to trick him? Did they know everything? The agents tried to put him at ease again. We don't want a formal statement or anything. You don't have to incriminate yourself. Just tell us in hypotheticals how we would go about getting some of these made up. Ross started to believe they had no idea who he really was. He loosened up. He told the agents that, hypothetically, anyone could go online to the dark web, to a place called Silk Road, and buy anything they wanted. The agents had no idea what Silk Road was. They weren't on any of the task forces. They weren't trying to make a case against Silk Road or the Dread Pirate Roberts. They just wanted to know about the IDs. The agents believed everything checked out and asked Ross for a phone number in case they needed to get back in touch with him. He said he didn't have one, but he did give them a fake email address, fractalform@tormail.com. The San Francisco Homeland Security agents thanked Ross and left it at that for the time being. Ross shut the door and let out a huge sigh of relief. Meanwhile, July was proving to be a very busy month for Jared Duryagian, the Homeland Security agent in Chicago. On July 14, the day after the deconfliction meeting with all of the other agencies, Jared received a call from FBI agent Chris Tarbell from the Cybercrime Division. Although Tarbell wasn't present at the deconfliction meeting, he watched Jared's presentation via video link and was impressed. Tarbell wanted to work with Jared. Tarbell explained to Jared that his cybercrime team had the holy grail of the Silk Road case, Silk Road server, but they hadn't been working on the case for that long, and they weren't sure where to start looking within the files. So they wanted Jared to fly to New York and work with them. Jared said he would love to, so long as he could still work on an important part of the case that he had developed. Jared was still working with the Silk Road seller accounts that he now had control of after identifying and arresting the original owners. Jared would take over the account and start striking up conversations with both buyers and sellers. With this method, he began talking to a volunteer moderator on Silk Road that went by the name Cirrus. After a few weeks of chatting, Jared became friends with Cirrus and told her he wanted to send her a gift. Cirrus allowed the gesture and provided an address. The next thing Cirrus knew, agents from Homeland Security were raiding her house in Texas. During the raid, Jared introduced himself to Cirrus and gave her two options. Either she give up her account and help the investigation, or she would be charged. Cirrus chose to give up her account. Jared's plan was to become Cirrus. He interviewed her in depth, learning everything about what she did on Silk Road. When did she log on? When did she log out? How long was she online for per day? What was her writing style when she wrote messages and posted on the forums? What did she post about? Jared bought the exact computer Cirrus had and installed all of the same programs she had. He didn't want to leave anything to chance. When he felt he had everything squared away, he logged on to Silk Road and became Cirrus. Just after he logged on, Cirrus received a message from the Dread Pirate Roberts offering a paid moderator's job. But before he would put her on the payroll, he required a driver's license or passport. Jared arranged a fake driver's license with a photograph of a female agent and sent the Dread Pirate Roberts the ID. It only took a few minutes for the Dread Pirate Roberts to respond and put Cirrus to work. It was a huge break in the investigation. By August, Jared was working in the Chicago Homeland Security office by day and working as Cirrus, the Silk Road moderator, by night. And it was at this time he was asked to fly to New York to assist the FBI Cybercrime Division. When he got to the FBI offices in New York, Agent Chris Tarbell showed Jared the computer where they had reconstructed Silk Road from the files on the server. Jared stared at the computer, and afterwards, he stared at a nearby wall that had an 8-foot long piece of paper stuck on it. There were IP addresses written down on the paper, with descriptions of where each IP address was located. As Jared kept his eyes on the paper, Tarbell explained to him some of the different IP addresses they had. One was a server for the chat clients of Silk Road. Another was a server that stored the bitcoins from the site. Another was for the mastermind section of the site, which was Dread Pirate Roberts' section as the main administrator. As Tarbell continued explaining the numbers, Jared noticed the name Momi Toby's in San Francisco. Tarbell explained that it was a cafe, and someone had logged in and tried to erase a Silk Road server from there. Because of that, the FBI had a theory that the Dread Pirate Roberts either lived, had visited, or even possibly still lived in San Francisco, and had used the cafe's Wi-Fi to access Silk Road. Although, as Tarbell explained to Jared, as quoted in the book American Kingpin by Nick Bilton, "Not much I can do with it. What am I going to do? Send an FBI agent into a coffee shop in San Francisco and tell them to look for someone on a laptop?" But they were still monitoring the cafe's internet traffic to see if they could find anything else. After this, Jared took a good look at the Silk Road offline version, or the reconstructed version that the FBI had made. It was essentially a site that looked exactly like Silk Road and had everything that Silk Road had, except that it wasn't live. It was just a clone they created using the server to assist their investigation. While Jared went through the Dread Pirate Roberts' different chat logs, he found more chats between him and the DEA agent Carl Force, who was undercover on the site posing as Nob. Jared noticed that there was also now encrypted chats between them. Jared asked Tarbell if he thought Carl Force was trying to obstruct the investigation in some way. Tarbell said he did feel that something was off about him. Then another visitor arrived at the cybercrime office. Gary Alford, the IRS agent who didn't speak up at the deconfliction meeting regarding the early forum posts he had found about Silk Road from someone going by the username Altoid. Gary had found out that the forum user named Altoid had registered with email address rossalbrecht@gmail.com, but that was quickly deleted and replaced with a fake email address, frosty@frosty.com. Gary didn't think that what he had found was important, and he had given up trying to find the Dread Pirate Roberts. He decided to stick to what he was supposed to do: follow the money. That's why he wanted to get a look at what was on Silk Road's server. Gary entered the office and took a look around, noticing the large piece of paper on the wall. Like Jared had, Gary also noticed the words Momi Toby's San Francisco. He asked Tarbell about it, and Tarbell told him the same story he had told Jared. Gary got a slight chill. He told Tarbell he was looking at someone who was living in San Francisco. Tarbell's response didn't impress Gary. Tarbell couldn't have acted any less interested in what he had to say. Gary hated the attitude some of the other people on the case had. The fact it was a competition, not a joint investigation. So he didn't say anything else. He didn't pass on the details of the guy he was looking at in San Francisco. If he had, Tarbell and Jared would have found out that the guy Gary was looking at in San Francisco was Ross Ulbricht. It was around this time that Ross's ex-girlfriend Julia arranged to meet up with him. Ross didn't want to make any mistakes or mix her up in his fake Joshua Terry identity that he had created for his new roommates. So he rented another room in San Francisco and took her there. They spent the night together, and the following day, Julia went out to explore San Francisco. She returned early, and when she entered the apartment, she found Ross with his back to her, staring at the computer. Staring at a page she thought she'd never see again. Silk Road. Ross didn't even hear Julia walk in. She took a moment before saying hi. Ross pressed the kill switch, making his computer shut down instantly, and said he was just catching up on some work. But Julia had seen all she needed to. Ross had obviously lied to her when he said he had given Silk Road away and no longer had anything to do with it. She flew back to Austin. Soon after that, Ross thought it might be time to leave San Francisco and go back to Austin as well. Not specifically because of Julia, but because too many things had happened while he was in San Francisco, including that visit from Homeland Security. So he thought it was time to start somewhere fresh. While Ross was contemplating moving, IRS investigator Gary Alford couldn't get him off his mind. Could Ross be the Dread Pirate Roberts? As detailed in the book American Kingpin, Gary started talking to a DEA agent in the New York office about Ross. It wasn't the first time the agent had heard Gary's theory, and he said, "You really think you're going to find him from a Google search?" Gary nodded. "I'm right. I'm sure of it." Gary asked the Homeland Security officer to run Ross Ulbricht's name. He had done this before already, but maybe now something new would come up, or maybe they would find something they had missed previously. The Homeland Security agent ran Ross's name and told Gary that Ross had a travel record. He'd recently gone to Dominica, which Gary found strange, since Dominica and the Caribbean in general was a place well known for money laundering. Then, the Homeland Security agent started to get a bit more excited. "Whoa, there's actually a hit on this guy from a few weeks ago." Gary listened intently as the Homeland Security agent read the report out loud. Fake IDs had been confiscated by customs, and agents from Homeland Security in San Francisco went to the house the IDs were addressed to. They spoke to a resident there by the name of Ross Ulbricht. The San Francisco agents noted that Ross's roommates knew him as Joshua Terry, not Ross Ulbricht. Ross paid for his room in cash. Before living at 15th Avenue, Ross had lived in Hickory Street in San Francisco's central area. The agent's notes read, Ulbricht generally refused to answer any questions, but he volunteered that hypothetically, anyone could go into a website named Silk Road on Tor and purchase any drugs or IDs. A chill ran down Gary's spine. He ran to his supervisor's office and screamed, "It's him! It's him!" The supervisor asked Gary to calm down and explain what was going on. Gary did, and the supervisor told him to call Seren Turner, the assistant US attorney that was working with FBI agent Chris Tarbell. Gary called Turner and started giving him an overexcited explanation. Turner had to tell him to slow down. Gary told him everything he knew. Turner wasn't convinced, but said it wouldn't hurt to check, and asked for Ross's address. Gary gave him the Hickory Street address, where Ross had lived with his friend Renee when he first moved to San Francisco. Turner punched it straight into Google Maps. Turner said, "Holy shit, it's around the corner from Momi Toby's cafe, where we found the IP address." Turner immediately arranged a conference call with Chris Tarbell, Jared Duryagian, and Gary Alford. Gary started from the beginning, elaborating on the Google search he'd done that led him to the 2 forum posts from someone called Altoid. He then went on to say that the user Altoid had originally registered with an email address, rossulbricht@gmail.com, but then deleted that address and entered a fake address, frosty@frosty.com. Tarbell stopped Gary. "What did you just say?" Gary started explaining again until he got to the Frosty part, and Tarbell interrupted him again. "Frosty as in Frosty." Gary was starting to get frustrated with the interruptions and said, "Yes, Frosty with that spelling. Why?" Tarbell answered, "Because when we got the server from Iceland, we saw that the server and the computer that belonged to the Dread Pirate Roberts were both called Frosty." The other men stayed silent on the line as it all sunk in. Gary Alford had found the Dread Pirate Roberts from a Google search. It took the agents a little over a week to set up an undercover surveillance team that would follow Ross Ulbricht's every move. Their operation resulted in the other agencies working on the case to immediately stand down. The email that was sent to the Baltimore Task Force instructed them to cease all activity on the Silk Road case, including logging onto Silk Road, its forum, or any undercover accounts. Carl Force panicked when he read the email. He'd heard rumours that the FBI might have found the Dread Pirate Roberts, but this confirmed it. He knew that if the FBI got into the Dread Pirate Roberts' computer, that would be the end of him. They would be able to see all of the conversations between the two of them, including the conversations Carl deleted, and the encrypted conversations where he was selling information while pretending to be a corrupt agent named Kevin. Carl immediately sent an encrypted message to the Dread Pirate Roberts, warning him that he had been identified and was about to be caught. He added in a threat that it was easy to get people in jail killed, and he had better delete all records of their conversations. The FBI kept Ross under surveillance for 2 weeks. They followed him every minute of the day. When he went out for a walk or spent time with friends or went to a cafe, they were watching. When Ross was seen on his laptop, the Dread Pirate Roberts was logged into Silk Road, and when Ross closed his laptop, it was the exact same time the Dread Pirate Roberts logged out of Silk Road. The agents had no doubt Ross Ulbricht was the man they were looking for. They scheduled the arrest to take place on October 1st, 2013. Agent Chris Tarbell flew to San Francisco a few days prior to join the team on the ground and to make sure everything was ready. When Tarbell landed in San Francisco, he realised there was a problem, and he called Jared Duryagian to join him. Jared was back in Chicago, still pretending to be Silk Road employee Cirrus. When he found out he was needed in San Francisco, he arranged for another Homeland Security agent to pose as Cirrus while he was on the plane. Jared then logged back in as Cirrus when he landed in San Francisco. As soon as Jared landed, he met with Agent Chris Tarbell and two other men. One of them was named Brophy, a special agent with the FBI in New York, and the other man was Thomas Kiernan, the computer scientist from the FBI's cybercrime division. Kiernan was there to take care of Ross's laptop after the arrest. It was imperative that the laptop stayed open and powered on. Information like Ross posting on forums about Silk Road and logging onto his computer at the exact same time as the Dread Pirate Roberts logged onto Silk Road would be worth nothing without the contents of his computer. A lawyer could easily argue that was all nothing more than a coincidence. And the fact the FBI needed Ross's laptop to make a case was part of the problem Tarbell was now facing. Tarbell explained that the team responsible for the arrest wouldn't be the FBI team from New York. It would be a local team from San Francisco. Although the FBI investigation was conducted in the New York office, when it came to arrests, there was a matter of jurisdiction that had to be respected. So because Ross was in San Francisco, a San Francisco team would make the arrest. The problem being, the San Francisco team weren't part of the investigation. They didn't know much about Ross or the Dread Pirate Roberts, and weren't fully aware of the implications if they didn't get access to his laptop. All the San Francisco team knew was that Ross was considered extremely dangerous. They had seen the chat logs from the server where he ordered the murders of Curtis Green, Friendly Chemist, Tony 76, and Tony's 3 partners. So because of that, the San Francisco team was going to arrest him with the assistance of a SWAT team. SWAT aren't known for entering places quietly, and if Ross heard them coming, it would give him time to press the kill switch on his laptop, completely shutting it down. Meaning, if his encryption was done right, it would be impossible for the FBI to get the evidence they needed. They had to catch him with his laptop open, while he was logged onto Silk Road. Tarbell explained he was trying to talk the local office out of using SWAT, but it wasn't going well. He then outlined another concern. DEA agent Carl Force from Baltimore had phoned him and demanded access to Silk Road's server. Tarbell told Carl he had to go through the proper channels and get authorization. Carl said he had authorization, but after a few questions from Tarbell, it was clear he didn't. Both Tarbell and Jared agreed Carl Force looked more suspicious by the day. Their suspicions were correct. Carl had made that phone call only minutes after he sent the threatening message to the Dread Pirate Roberts about being able to have people killed in jail. Carl was trying to get access to the server to see if he could get rid of any incriminating evidence against him. The following day, October 1st, 2013, Agent Tarbell's request to make the arrest without SWAT was officially denied. The local office explained that the Dread Pirate Roberts was considered dangerous, and they wouldn't risk losing an agent over a laptop. Tarbell tried arguing that in this case, the laptop was almost as important as the life of an agent, but they weren't having it. They were using SWAT, and that was final. The arrest was scheduled to happen in Ross's apartment with the help of the SWAT team the following day, October 2nd, but Agent Tarbell, Jared Duryagan and Thomas Kiernan came up with a new plan. One without SWAT. The three of them were gathered outside a cafe called Bello, located about a 5-minute walk from Ross's apartment. They weren't the only agents there either. There were several agents spread out around the area in case Ross walked out of his apartment. Their new plan was to try and arrest Ross in a public area. They thought that if they could get Ross using public Wi-Fi, and at the same time, they could get Jared chatting with him while he was posing as Silk Road employee Cirrus, then there would be no denying that Ross was the Dread Pirate Roberts. Ross had visited the Bello Cafe only the day before, so they hoped he'd reappear there again. They waited anxiously, praying he would show up. The time was 1 p.m. Jared was watching the screen of his laptop, keeping an eye on the Dread Pirate Roberts, who was connected to the staff chat of Silk Road. But at 2:47 p.m, the Dread Pirate Roberts signed out of the chat. Jared checked his battery level. It was down to 18%. Since the Dread Pirate Roberts was no longer online, Jared made his way inside the Bellow Cafe to charge his computer. The cafe was jammed-packed with people, but Jared managed to find an open PowerPoint. It was the only one available. He started charging his computer and was planning on ordering a coffee when Tarbell stormed into the cafe and told him Ross had left his apartment and was currently walking in their direction. Jared quickly removed his computer from the PowerPoint, left the coffee shop and made his way across the street. He sat on a bench next to computer scientist Thomas Kiernan. Both agents pretended to be busy on their devices while they waited for an update on Ross's location. They soon got it. Ross turned up to the Bellow Cafe, just as they had hoped. Jared watched as Ross entered the cafe and then cursed under his breath when Ross walked out only 30 seconds later. Jared knew why. In chats with his employees, the Dread Pirate Roberts had instructed them never to access Silk Road in a place where someone could look over their shoulder. The cafe was packed, so it was too dangerous for Ross to log on. Ross turned right and kept going until he found the next available place that had Wi-Fi. The Glen Park Library. The moment Ross walked into the library, computer scientist Thomas Kiernan followed him. He had been instructed to keep an eye on Ross's computer at all times, so he took up a position inside. Undercover surveillance agents had already followed Ross in as well. Agent Tarbell sat down next to Jared outside the library. Jared was keeping a close eye on his laptop, waiting for the Dread Pirate Roberts to reconnect to the staff chat on Silk Road. Tarbell had given strict instructions to all of the other agents present to wait for Jared to get chatting with the Dread Pirate Roberts on the Silk Road employee chat before anyone made a move against him. Jared kept looking at the screen anxiously. Minutes seemed like hours. Until finally, at 3:08 p.m, the Dread Pirate Roberts reconnected to the Silk Road staff chat. Jared took his opportunity and using the Silk Road employee account of Cirrus that he had taken over, he typed, "Hi." But there was no response. Jared kept looking at the screen, waiting. After 1 minute passed, he tried again. "Are you there?" 30 long seconds ticked by. The Dread Pirate Roberts responded, "Hey." Jared typed, "How are you doing?" The Dread Pirate Roberts answered, "I'm okay. You?" Jared said, "Good. Can you check out one of the flagged messages for me?" Jared knew that the Dread Pirate Roberts could only access the flagged messages from the main administrator section of Silk Road, otherwise known as the Mastermind section. If they caught Ross in that part of the site, it was game over, as only the Dread Pirate Roberts could access it. Another long minute passed before the Dread Pirate Roberts answered, "Sure, let me log in." But before he logged in, he sent his test question, like he did with all of his employees. Only the Dread Pirate Roberts and the employee knew the answer to the question. It was a security measure to make sure it was really them. If Jared gave the wrong answer, the Dread Pirate Roberts would shut down the account. The Dread Pirate Roberts typed, "You did Bitcoin exchange before you started working for me, right?" The real Cirrus had told Jared what the answer to the question was when Jared took over her account. But in this high-pressure moment, he was struggling to remember it. Jared tentatively replied, "Yes, but just for a little bit." The Dread Pirate Roberts responded, "Not any more than that." Jared, "No, I stopped because of the reporting requirements." Sweat poured off Jared. Time seemed to stand still. Had he gotten it right? Or had he just blown the investigation? It seemed like an eternity before the Dread Pirate Roberts responded. Okay, which post? Jared knew this was it. The Dread Pirate Roberts was exactly where they needed him to be, in the mastermind section. He signalled to Chris Tarbell to go. Tarbell gave the order. Pull Ross's laptop first, and then make the arrest. At 3:15 p.m. inside the library, Ross was staring at his computer when he heard a loud scream coming from behind him. The scream was from a woman. She yelled "fuck you" to a man standing by her side. Ross was startled and turned around to see what was going on. The man had his fist raised and was about to punch the woman. But the punch never came. Ross was confused and turned back to his laptop. But it wasn't there. The man and woman pretending to argue were FBI agents. They took Ross by the arms and screamed at him to stay still. Another agent had taken Ross's computer away from him while he was distracted by the fake argument. Agent Brophy appeared and handcuffed Ross. Then he made him stand up and walk to the door of the library where Tarbell and Jared were waiting. Tarbell and Jared escorted Ross outside the library, and Ross asked what he was being charged with. Tarbell held up a piece of paper. United States of America vs. Ross William Ulbricht, aka Dread Pirate Roberts, aka DPR, aka Silk Road. Jared left Ross with Tarbell and returned to the library. He saw that Ross was logged into the main administrator section of Silk Road. The Silk Road support page and Tor chat were open as well, which showed the conversation Jared had just been having with him through Cirrus's account. Thomas Kiernan carefully carried the laptop out of the library and into a waiting vehicle. He had to make sure the laptop remained on at all times, so as he sat with it in the car, he moved his finger on the mousepad regularly, so it was never out of activity. Kiernan was driven to a special van that was a mobile computer forensics lab. He started going through Ross's laptop with another computer expert. One of the first things they did was look for any traps, like a kill switch. The agents checked carefully, and over the next 10 hours, the laptop's contents were backed up 6 times. FBI agents conducted a thorough search of Ross's apartment. They found 2 thumb drives on his bedside table and 2 pieces of paper in the garbage can, which showed that Ross had been designing a new rating system for Silk Road. The notes seemed cryptic. They included different keywords and ideas for the rating system. When the agents matched up these notes to several forum posts from the Dread Pirate Roberts discussing the new rating system, every keyword matched. News of the arrest broke immediately. The FBI announced that they believed Silk Road had turned over $1.2 billion in revenue, with Ross alone pocketing $80 million in commissions in the 2 years and 10 months the site had been running. The story of the former Eagle Scout turned crime kingpin made headlines around the world. Those who were close to Ross couldn't believe it. His family denied the allegations, saying Ross wasn't capable of doing what the FBI were alleging. His roommates in San Francisco, the place Ross found on Craigslist and paid for in cash, got a shock when they saw the front page of the paper. Ross Ulbricht. He looks a lot like our old roommate Joshua Terry. They had to do a double and triple take. It was him. Ross hired lawyer Joshua Dratel to represent him. He was offered a plea deal before the case went to trial, pled guilty and served 10 years to life, but he refused it. There were 7 charges in total: narcotics trafficking, distribution of narcotics by means of the internet, and conspiracy to traffic narcotics, which all carried a sentence of 10 years to life. Running a continual criminal enterprise, commonly known as the Kingpin charge, which carried a sentence of 20 years to life. It could actually result in the death penalty if it was proven the person charged had committed murder. The remaining 3 charges were computer hacking, money laundering, and trafficking false documents. The three of those charges, if put together, could lead to a sentence of 40 years to life. The one thing that Ross wasn't charged with was murder. The charges were considered since they found the chat logs where the Dread Pirate Roberts ordered hits on 6 different individuals. But they knew the hit on Curtis Green never actually happened. That had been faked. And when the FBI searched for the real identities of Friendly Chemist, Tony76, and Tony's 3 partners, they couldn't find anything. No murders on their database matched to the dates and times the hits allegedly took place. The more they looked into it, the more it seemed that no murders ever took place at all. And Ross had paid a total of $730,000 for 6 murders that were never committed. But he thought they had. He had received the pictures of what he thought were dead people as proof the hits had taken place. He just didn't realise they were faked. Ross had been found with his computer open on Silk Road, but he believed that's all the FBI had. He had encrypted the rest of his files, his diary, his chat logs, the photographs of what he thought were dead bodies from the hits, and many other files. They were all encrypted with a password that Ross believed the FBI would never find. But Thomas Kiernan and his associate found the password hidden in the RAM of Ross's laptop. The password was Purple Orange Beach. That password unlocked everything on Ross's computer. The FBI had it all. Ross hadn't been as careful as he thought. Ross's trial started on January 13, 2015. It lasted 3 weeks in total. Ross had a lot of people on his side. He didn't just have his family and friends, but many other people who subscribed to his beliefs and defended him, saying all he did was run a website, and if that was to be considered a crime, then the CEOs of large websites such as eBay and Craigslist should be considered criminals as well. There were pamphlets all over the stairs of the federal courthouse with people rallying for Ross. Leading the prosecution was Seren Turner, the assistant US attorney who had worked so closely with Agent Tarbell during the investigation. He explained to the jury how all of the technology worked, and he showed them the chat logs between the Dread Pirate Roberts and several employees and users, including all the chats with Variety Jones. In one chat log, Variety Jones promised he would get the Dread Pirate Roberts out of prison if he was ever caught, because with the amount of money they were generating, he would be able to hire a small country to break him out. But Variety Jones wasn't coming to help. When Joshua Draytell's turn came to present Ross's side, the defence he used was that Ross wasn't the Dread Pirate Roberts. He had given the site away. Draytell admitted Ross was the creator of Silk Road, but in November 2011, when Ross told his original programmer Richard that he'd given the site away, Draytell claimed he had actually done it. The site had proven to be too stressful, and he didn't want to have anything to do with it anymore. After he gave it away, he headed to Australia with his sister and tried to forget about it. Draytell said the Dread Pirate Roberts first appeared after Ross had already given the site away, so everything that happened after that had nothing to do with Ross. He had no knowledge of it. The evidence the FBI found on Ross's laptop was all planted by the real Dread Pirate Roberts. Ross had been hacked, and the evidence planted to frame him. The book American Kingpin by Nick Bilton highlights some of the key arguments and quotes within the courtroom. Seren Turner, quote, "His conduct was brazenly illegal. He knew perfectly well what he was doing the whole time. He built it, he grew it, he operated it from top to bottom until the very end. And then there is the defendant's attempt to explain away mountains of evidence on his computer. It's a hacker. It's a virus. It's ludicrous. There were no little elves that put all of that evidence on the defendant's computer. He knew perfectly well what he was doing the whole time, and you should find him guilty on all counts." Joshua Draytell, quote, "One of the fundamental principles in this case is that Dread Pirate Roberts and Mr. Ulbricht cannot be the same person. Saving those chats, does that sound like Dread Pirate Roberts? You have to actually enable the chats to be saved. Keeping a journal like that and then saving it on your laptop. A little too convenient. There are a lot of blinking neon signs in this case that have been created to incriminate Mr. Albrecht. It's not the same person. The internet is not what it seems. You can create an entire fiction. I'm confident in deliberations, you will reach only one conclusion. Ross Ulbricht is not guilty on every count in the indictment. It was Draytel's argument that the FBI hadn't caught the Dread Pirate Roberts, so they settled on Ross because they needed to catch someone. He even hinted that the authorities had something to do with the frame, as they were under pressure to solve the case. But the jury didn't buy it. Ross Ulbricht was found guilty. Before sentencing, Judge Catherine Forrest didn't have an easy time. She received a huge amount of letters pleading to give Ross a light sentence. The letters spoke of his character and how he was such an incredible person and a role model. Ross himself wrote a letter to the judge saying that he now understood firsthand that jail was a hard place to live, but what hurt him the most was the pain he was causing his family. He also mentioned that when he started Silk Road, he had been naive and he now regretted his actions. He ended the letter with, "I've had my youth, and I know you must take away my middle years, but please leave me my old age. Please leave a small light at the end of the tunnel, an excuse to stay healthy, an excuse to dream of better days ahead, and a chance to redeem myself in the free world before I meet my maker." It wasn't just messages of support for Ross that the judge received. She also received a very public threat. Someone published her home address and personal information online, along with a comment that read, "Fuck this stupid bitch. I hope some drug cartel that lost a lot of money with the seizure of the Silk Road will murder this lady and her entire family." The threat didn't stop Judge Forrest from handing down Ross's sentence on May 29, 2015. Quote, "You were the captain of the ship as the Dread Pirate Roberts, and you made your own laws, and you enforced those laws in the manner that you saw fit. It was, in fact, a carefully planned life's work. It was your opus. You wanted it to be your legacy, and it is." After that, she addressed a point Ross's lawyer had raised. He presented a research paper to the court about drug distribution, suggesting that Silk Road could be better for society because it would reduce violence and it would also encourage the sale of better quality drugs. Judge Forrest, quote, "No drug dealer from the Bronx selling meth or heroin or crack has ever made this kind of argument to the court. It is a privileged argument. You are no better a person than any other drug dealer, and your education does not give you a special place of privilege in our criminal justice system." Then, she addressed the murders for hire that Ross had ordered. She stated that although no bodies were found, it didn't really matter, because Ross had paid for the murders, and he had gotten photographs of what he thought were dead bodies. So as far as Ross was concerned, those murders did happen. This is a heated point of contention. Ross never faced trial for the murders, so the argument is they should never have been mentioned in his case. The prosecution and the judge were using the murders for hire to make the case against Ross look much worse. But that's not what he was charged with. Judge Forrest finished with, quote, "There is no reason for me to make a choice between these two people that I see that are on display. The Ulbricht who is the leader of the criminal enterprise, and the Ulbricht who is known and loved. What is clear is that people are very, very complex, and you are one of them. There is good in you, Mr. Ulbricht, I have no doubt, but there is also bad, and what you did in connection with Silk Road was terribly destructive to our social fabric. Mr. Ulbricht, it is my judgment delivered here, now, on behalf of our country, that you are sentenced to a period of life imprisonment in the federal system. There is no parole, and you shall serve your life in prison." Nobody was able to believe the sentence given to Ross. It was actually above and beyond what the prosecution requested. His supporters, and especially his mother Lynn, had created an ongoing campaign to free him that started almost as soon as Ross was arrested. The campaign carried the name Free Ross and has an official website at freeross.org. In it, Lynn has uploaded and shared everything related to the case. She continues to speak out publicly about what she believes was an unfair arrest, an unfair trial, and a severely excessive sentence. From the moment Ross was arrested on October 1st, 2013, the government acted poorly and suspiciously in the eyes of Ross's supporters. For starters, after his arrest, he was kept in solitary confinement for 6 weeks, and neither Ross nor his family were informed as to why. He was only permitted to leave solitary confinement during his bail hearing. Various members of his family and supporters offered every economic resource they had, including their own homes, to bail Ross out. They also wrote a lot of letters to the judge about his good character, but it was all in vain. Ross wasn't given bail because he was considered a dangerous individual due to the murder-for-hire allegations. 2 months after the bail hearing, the murder-for-hire charges were officially dropped, but bail was still denied. In preparation for the trial, more problems arose. Ross was given permission by the court to help his attorneys review the evidence against him. However, the evidence against him equalled 6 terabytes, or 2.5 billion single-spaced pages, and for long periods of time, he was not given either a laptop or software to review the evidence. In the trial itself, 2 important witnesses from the defence weren't allowed to take the stand. One of them was Andreas Antonopoulos, a Bitcoin expert, and the other was Stephen Bellovin, a computer networking and security expert from Columbia University. Both men are very well known in their fields. The defence wanted Antonopoulos to give a real and clear view of how Bitcoin works, since it's a complicated matter, and it was likely few of the jurors, if any, had any idea about it. In Bellovin's case, the defence wanted him to explain how the FBI's version of how they found Silk Road's server sounded a bit too good to be true. The FBI's version was challenged by various security experts, and the defence wanted to explore further. But neither Antonopoulos nor Bellovin were allowed to testify. The judge stated both witnesses were unnecessary. But the government was allowed to call their Bitcoin expert, one who worked as a consultant for the FBI and was paid to take the stand. Chris Tarbell, who had led Ross's arrest and the discovery of the Silk Road server, never took the stand. Furthermore, there was an entire new revelation about Jared Duryagian's investigation. 13 days before the trial began, the defence was provided with 5,000 pages of the investigation Jared had conducted. Within those pages, Jared had actually named somebody else who he thought could be the Dread Pirate Roberts. This other suspect was around Ross's age, had operated as a Bitcoin launderer, had a computer programming background, was a computer systems developer, and had operated different websites, including Bitcoin Talk, the forum where one of the first posts promoting Silk Road appeared. Other agents had spoken to this suspect, and he allegedly offered to give them the name of the real Dread Pirate Roberts if they left him alone. It was a few weeks later that Ross Ulbricht was arrested. The defence wanted to explore this further, and on the 3rd day of the trial, Joshua Dratel, Ross's lawyer, started cross-examining Jared about his other suspect. But he was stopped before he could really start. Seren Turner from the prosecution objected to any line of questioning that led down the path of another Dread Pirate Roberts. He argued that the whole point of the trial was that Ross was the Dread Pirate Roberts. The court was adjourned for a couple of days to enable a decision to be made. When the trial resumed, the judge agreed with the prosecution and banned any questioning on Jared's other suspect. All in all, Ross's mum, Lynn, states that the government conducted a very controlled narrative before, throughout, and after the trial. She said the facts presented were very carefully selected to tell the story the government wanted to tell, and justice had been far from served. Recently, in an interview Lynn gave with dailycoin.org, She said this about the justice system. Quote, "I have been absolutely shocked at how I've seen it operate in this case, and of course in many others. And so I had my eyes opened over and over again. And I feel like what I've seen is so really concerning and frightening that everyone should care, because our justice system is so broken. And so our constitutional protections are being eroded, and there's so much unfairness that it really is shocking. And I've become a lot more sceptical and a lot more outraged, not only for Ross, but for so many." Ross was actually sentenced to 2 terms of life imprisonment without parole, and was given 40 years on top as well. What Lynn and Ross's supporters consider most unfair is that the sentencing is based primarily on the fact that he ran Silk Road. Hence, he's taking the blame for all of the crimes others committed inside Silk Road. Consider his sentence to infamous serial killer and cult leader Charles Manson. Manson and other members of the Manson family at least were able to apply for parole. Ross will never have that chance. Ross's computer contained a large amount of evidence, but to this day, some question if all that evidence truly belonged to him. Some still firmly believe he was framed by the real Dread Pirate Roberts. And there are others who feel that even if all the evidence was his, it was obtained illegally. One of the main points made by the defence was that no proper warrants were granted before searching inside Ross's computer, which was a violation of his Fourth Amendment rights. However, the judge ruled that there were proper warrants in place, and his Fourth Amendment rights were not infringed. The appeal judges agreed with the trial judge on this point. Apart from the chat logs of the Dread Pirate Roberts, his personal diary, and catching Ross red-handed in the mastermind section of Silk Road, they also found a lot of money on Ross's computer. He had 144,000 bitcoins, worth close to around $20 million at the time of his arrest. These were auctioned off by the US government, and by the time the auction was held, the price of Bitcoin had gone up, so they were able to get $50 million. The FBI also found a folder that contained all of Ross's employee IDs that he kept as part of his security measures. One of those IDs belonged to Roger Thomas Clark, a 54-year-old Canadian man. The FBI, Homeland Security and the DEA believe Roger Thomas Clark is Variety Jones. They tracked him down hiding out in a hotel room in Thailand. He was arrested and is still being held in Thailand awaiting extradition to the United States, where he's expected to face trial for narcotics trafficking and money laundering. In total, more than 100 people were arrested in 43 different countries who had either bought or sold from Silk Road, or worked for Silk Road. Curtis Green, who Ross paid Knob to kill, was facing up to 40 years imprisonment. However, the judge took into account that Curtis was tortured and had a murder faked by government officials, so he gave him a sentence of time served. Curtis now sells Silk Road hats, t-shirts, and is writing a memoir about his time as a Silk Road employee. As for Carl Force, the Baltimore DEA agent who posed as Knob on Silk Road, he was given an award for his work on the case. Carl even thought about going in the same direction as Curtis and contacted book publishers and studios in Hollywood. He wanted to sell the story of the DEA agent who helped bring down Silk Road. But it wasn't long before things started falling apart for Carl. The FBI and the IRS had been tracing the bitcoins that had entered and left Silk Road. They found that some bitcoins went straight into an account owned by Carl Force. They started an undercover investigation on him, and they began finding other things. They found especially incriminating messages to the Dread Pirate Roberts from someone under the pseudonym French Maid. French Maid was another identity Carl had created. He had done it shortly before Ross's arrest. Under the French Maid account, Carl told the Dread Pirate Roberts he had information he would want to hear. For that information, Carl asked for $100,000, and Ross paid it. But Carl made a big error. In the messages under the French Maid account, he signed off using his real name, Carl. He realised his error and sent another message saying his real name was Carla, but he was fooling no one. After investigating further, they eventually uncovered all of the other encrypted and deleted messages Carl had sent the Dread Pirate Roberts under his other account names of Nob and Kevin. In total, from the fake murder hit and the information he sold about the case, Carl had pocketed $757,000. Carl surrendered and pled guilty to the charges. He was sentenced to 6.5 years in federal prison. He wasn't the only one involved in the investigation who was up to no good either. Secret Service agent Sean Bridges, who Carl had teamed up with at one point, had stolen bitcoins as well. Ross had been wrong all along. He ordered the hit on the wrong person. Curtis Green wasn't the one who stole $350,000 worth of bitcoins from him. It was Sean Bridges who stole them. During the arrest of Curtis Green, Bridges saw that Curtis had access to many users' bitcoins. When no one was watching, Bridges redirected $350,000 worth into an account with a fake business name. Bridges actually returned to Curtis's computer and stole even more money after that. The FBI eventually found that these missing bitcoins pointed to Bridges, so they started an undercover investigation on him as well. Bridges found out about the investigation, and he had a fake passport and a bulletproof vest on him when he was arrested trying to leave the country. Bridges pled guilty to the charges. In total, he had stolen over $800,000. He was given a sentence of close to 6 years. As for Gary Alford, whose Google searches found the Dread Pirate Roberts, he still works for the IRS. And after the Silk Road case, he was given an award which he keeps on his desk. It reads, "The Sherlock Holmes of cyberspace." FBI agent Chris Tarbell left the FBI after someone posted all of his personal information online in retaliation for his work on the case. His home address and his children's school address were posted. He now works for a cyber consultancy company where he assists the government and businesses on cyber-related crimes. On November 6, 2013, just 1 month after Ross's arrest, Silk Road 2.0 opened for business. A moderator from the original Silk Road site posted the following announcement, taken from the book Silk Road by Eileen Ormsby. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to announce our new home. As I've always stated, even with Silk Road itself, you should act at all times as though any site or marketplace you visit has been compromised from the very beginning. That is the only way to ensure that you do not become lax with your security. Do not fall into a false sense of security at any time on any site. Do not get comfortable. When you get comfortable, you get confident. When you get confident, you get cocky. And when you get cocky, you get caught." With the necessary security warnings out of the way, I look forward to seeing you all over on the new site. Let law enforcement waste their time and resources, whilst we make a statement to the world that we will not allow jackbooted government thugs trample our freedom. We are born free, yet moments later we are shackled by the rule of law. It is time once again to break free of those shackles. In the beginning, Silk Road 2.0 was the answer for all those who missed the original Silk Road. There were even some of the same moderators. But it didn't last long. Some of the moderators were arrested, and Silk Road 2.0 was shut down. Then Silk Road 3.0 appeared. A number of other black market websites also appeared under various names, but there are those who feel these sites are nothing more than scams or law enforcement traps. In May 2017, Ross lost an appeal against his life sentence. One of the judges on the 3-judge panel said this, quote, "Reasonable people may and do disagree about the social utility of harsh sentences for the distribution of controlled substances, or even of criminal prohibition of their sale and use at all. It is very possible that at some future point we will come to regard these policies as tragic mistakes and adopt less punitive and more effective methods of reducing the incidence and costs of drug use. At this point in our history, however, the democratically elected representatives of the people have opted for a policy of prohibition, backed by severe punishment. Courts have the power to condemn a young man to die in prison. and judges must exercise that power only in a small number of cases after the deepest thought and reflection. Although we might not have imposed the same sentence ourselves in the first instance, on the facts of this case, a life sentence was within the range of permissible decisions. In March 2012, Ross Ulbricht, aka the Dread Pirate Roberts, wrote the following post on the Silk Road forums. "Someday, we could be a shining beacon of hope for the oppressed people of the world, just as so many oppressed and violated souls have found refuge here already. Will it happen overnight? No. Will it happen in a lifetime? I don't know. Is it worth fighting for until my last breath? Of course. Once you've seen what's possible, how can you do otherwise? How can you plug yourself into the tax-eating, life-sucking, violent, sadistic, warmongering, oppressive machine ever again? How can you kneel when you've felt the power of your own legs, felt them stretch and flex as you learn to walk and think as a free person? I would rather live my life in rags now than in golden chains. And now we can have both. Now it is profitable to throw off one's chains, with amazing crypto technology reducing the risk of doing so dramatically. How many niches have yet to be filled in the world of anonymous online markets? The opportunity to prosper and take part in a revolution of epic proportions is at our fingertips." Judge Catherine Forrest, during the sentencing of Ross Ulbricht, aka the Dread Pirate Roberts. "I make this judgment mindful of the crimes that you have committed and the needs for the severest possible penalty to be imposed. There must be no doubt that lawlessness will not be tolerated. There must be no doubt that no one is above the law, no matter the education or the privileges. All stand equal before the law. There must be no doubt that you cannot run a massive criminal enterprise and, because it occurred over the internet, minimise the crime committed on that basis. For those considering stepping into your shoes, carrying some flag, some misguided flag, or doing something similar, they need to understand very clearly and without equivocation that if you break the law this way, there will be very, very severe consequences."